traveling to consciousness, exploring spiritual journeys to find answers in uncertainty.
We are live. Marc Champagne, what's up, my man? How are we doing today?
100%. I'm excited to be here. As we were chatting about before, I'm captivated by your setup behind you. It's awesome. Or I
Yeah,
should say above you as well.
it's all around, right? It's about the entire environment. Yeah, and majority of people listen to the podcast, but yeah, what Mark's referring to is I have I kind of got this like copper pyramid. If anyone listened to the podcast I did with Altea, we kind of talked about it a little bit more in depth, but Mark was asking about it, and I was like, let's just tell him what it is on the podcast. So in the Love One material, who they like channeled Ra, who was like the god of Egypt,
Okay.
and essentially what Ra says is that he talks about how he actually created the Great Pyramids in Egypt and how he assisted with it, and what he talks about is like the geometry of it is actually designed to help like the human body synchronize. It's supposed to help with meditation and healing. So what a lot of people did is they actually created these like copper pipes that essentially form the vertices. I believe it's called the vertices, where two faces of a structure meet. So right now there's copper pipes that are essentially the vertices of the pyramid, which I'm sitting in. And the idea is supposed to help with healing and alignment, and just based off the angles of it, that's kind of as much as I know about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, with all of this stuff, like, just in I guess my backstory and journey and whatnot in mental fitness, I find it all just so fascinating. And if like, we can almost default to, because there's different varying degrees of like what people believe and what people don't and so forth. But like, even what you're saying, like, what is the downside? Just like roll with it, right?
Yeah.
And like that's not, for me, that's what I've enjoyed most about just being on this path of curiosity. And like, well, what, like, there's so much out there. There's so much we don't know. And like we come at this world and journey in life as if like we know everything in a way, or we've advanced so far with our technology and this and that, but like, have we really? I mean, maybe there was something way bigger before us, like we don't know, right?
It's so difficult. And I mean, the more I look at it, it seems to me that there's probably like an oscillating wave of like intelligence, where we get super intelligent, then we forget, then we get super intelligent, then we forget. Because like,
Yeah.
even look back at it now, speaking of the pyramids, we have no idea. The short answer is that we have no idea how they were actually created. I mean, where I'm at now is they probably use some sort of harmonics or sounds or vibrations to actually levitate the rocks. I mean, and even the deeper I'm kind of going into Hinduism and Buddhism now that I'm kind of looking into, I mean, it just seems like there is this underlying force that we're operating at like 10% of our capability, just from our
Yeah.
mind and like our attachment to this physical realm.
Yeah. Well, and I watched, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's I just pulled up the name. It's on Netflix right now, Ancient Apocalypse. You,
Yeah.
with the journalist Graham Hancock.
Yeah.
And I mean, he gets a lot of heat for his work because it's like debunking, dates and basically the history that we know from archaeologists. And for whatever reason, which I still don't understand this, uh, they don't like that, because then they have to potentially rewrite history and it changes a lot of things. But if you can like put all that stuff aside and just go into it, and into a show like that, or a documentary, or just even a conversation, I mean, there has to be something bigger and that we don't understand from even how we describe our technology within our civilization that's created some of these wild, monuments and structures. And there's just too much synchronicity and like perfection in all of these things to even come up with an idea in modern times of how these things were created, right?
It's interesting. If we go back to touch on what you were saying with with how like there's this resistance to new ideas and new information. It's always kind of perplexed me, right? Because there's something to be said for going either side of the spectrum, right? Of so rigid that we're only going to believe this physical
Yeah.
world, this material world. And then there's also something to be said for like that there's danger in. There's danger in going to the other side where it's like, we'll just believe anything. Like, oh, there's a
Yeah.
pyramid. Like, okay, that has to be true, right? Like, there's a danger on both sides of there. So, where in this universe do we get that? Okay, we should maybe be a little bit resistant to any like new ideas, like Graham Hancock, for instance, is presenting, but at some level we do need to approach these new ideas with the curiosity of what if, how does
Yeah.
this fit into our model already, where's it a little bit different, and how do we like adapt to it?
Totally. And that's the dance. Like to me, that's where the magic is, right? It's just, it's first of all, not taking everything so damn seriously, including ourselves. And just, I think it just, I guess what continues to come to mind for me is just following your own curiosity and then checking in with yourself as well. Like what really feels right here, and like what feels really misaligned or far out there, or where I can kind of pull the string a little bit to uncover a little bit more. And I don't know, I don't think there's any right answer, but I do agree with your thought process around just the extremes, right? And just being careful. Like there's typically there's not, like anytime we go into these extremes, usually it doesn't lead us to the place that we're where we want to be, or where we are happiest, or feel like we're making good progress or content, and so forth. It's usually some sort of balance in between. So if we can somehow remain subjective, and I think I'm biased just with the work, obviously, but if our minds are mentally fit, and we do, we have our own practices and rituals to do everything possible to keep them clear and available to think and reflect on that level, then you start seeing, you start seeing the path, you start seeing like, okay, well, that makes sense. Like I want to go down that road, and I feel like you're less controlled by others' agendas, because your mind is not on autopilot. It's you're calling the shots for the most part.
Yeah, and that's a huge piece of the puzzle actually in my story with the C word that will give us a red flag if we talk about it. But whenever that whole thing started unraveling, I was very disconnected from media and news. So like
Yeah.
I had no idea what was going on. It was probably February-ish of 2019 or 2020, whenever people were like, hey, we should worry about this. And I'm like, yo, I'm a healthy person. I'm going to the gym 6, 8 times a day. Like I'm good. I'm, in the, how old was I? 26, 27. So I was like, all right, like we're good, and it was interesting how like my intuition led me to, okay, this probably came from that lab. This probably is
Yeah.
the whole structure. This is probably where the money's flowing. And it was crazy to me how I kind of came to that pretty quickly. And to give the devil his due, I was a little shaky based on the fear that I was surrounded by, based on, the doubt
Yeah.
that other people were placing on me. But now it's like we're 2 years, 2.5 years out, and everything that I like, all my intuition was telling me was true, is like now starting to become mainstream. And so it's this very interesting dilemma of how much of how much do we fully trust in it, but then like measure that against what the current belief system is, and how do we like it's that dance of like, how do I come across as not being crazy but knowing this core fundamental truth, and how do you help people along on their own journey to discover that truth for themselves?
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think it's again, like what resonates with me in what you said is that intuitive hunch, right? And when we're self-aware enough to follow it and continue to follow it, then, at least we could feel good about our decisions. I think
Hmm.
that's probably I guess the baseline feeling that I've had over the last few years of just, so I feel like I've been pulled all over the place and with conflicting messaging and conflicting, decisions. And then like I'm questioning this, and I'm like, well, I really respect that person. Like I don't at all align with what they're saying. Like how are we so far apart? Like those are the things I, really struggled with. But, and thankfully my wife and I were on the same page. We just kept coming back to, if you look at all of this from a lens of common sense and just natural, I guess nature, I should say, just nature in general, none of what we're being fed makes any sense for the most part. And I don't know. I mean, it's just at one point, I think you just have to like accept your position in all of this. And I think again with the extremes, like, respect others as well in terms of where they're at on their journey and whatnot, and what they believe in and so forth. But anytime you go against your intuition on something, I don't know. I've never come out the other side and be like, well, that was a really good decision. Clearly I felt something and I did the opposite, and that led to a good outcome. It just, for me, typically that's never the case. And I imagine most people listening, it's the same thing, right? So it's no different in this situation. And ironically, not ironically, really, like a lot of the stuff that I imagine your intuition was raising red flags against is all coming out as, oh yeah, that's fact. And no one wants to talk about that. It's crazy. I kind of came out of that whole period of our life, which I hope is behind us, or quickly becoming behind us. Almost just disappointment with society, I think, in general, throughout that whole experience. It was a really sad experience for us as a civilization, unfortunately.
Well, that's where it kind of gets interesting. And I was just talking to my, I think, dad at lunch about this, which is almost our inability as humans to, like we were saying earlier, right? We get intelligent, we forget. We get intelligent, we forget. It happens even just with like ideologies, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, it's like, the underlying idea or belief system that existed in Mao's China or Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Italy still pervades in the like underlying belief system of human ideology. And whether that's to feel safe or to be afraid of something is probably the crux of it. But it's just so fascinating that those underlying mechanisms to me are still there. Like,
Yeah.
you
And
still
so we
hear
don't learn
people,
from them,
yeah,
right? Like world
where
wars
we
too,
forget
same
or
thing.
something. Yeah.
Like, I don't get it. I do get it, because it always just comes back to the same thing: money and power, all the time. If you swap out the topic, whether it's a pandemic, a war, whatever it is, right from the beginning of history, always comes back to some sort of money and power, which is, I guess, interesting from, at least from my perspective, as someone who studies people's minds, more so for the questions they're reflecting on, and mental fitness and whatnot. It'd be an interesting experiment to really really try to go into the study of these like power dynamics and why. Like, I know Robert Greene writes a lot about this topic, but like, what is it? Like, why as a human species, we just like almost come out of character for for these power dynamics and so forth. Like, what is fueling that? Like, can we cut that? Can we rewire? Can we upgrade our software so we can stop going down these ridiculous journeys where literally people are dying and so forth, and miserable and unhappy? I don't think we deserve that.
Well, so, and this is kind of interesting because I was just talking to a girl about this the other day, and she was kind of coming at it from the lens of, basically, I don't want to misquote it, but in the sense of, why do guys essentially lie to get with girls? And the reason I bring that up is because I think there's a very interesting parallel between what you're saying right here, which is the idea of power, right? I think that, and it's not all, I'm sure it's not all in every situation, but there are some times whenever there is this sense of power that comes from, let's say, conquering sex with a girl, or in the money case, conquering other people, having more money than other people. And where I'm kind of at in my whole journey is that it seems to me as though people are unable to find that power within themselves, so they look to the outside world to grant them that validation that they're missing already from an internal state.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes me think of really all of Gabor Mate's work, and anyone in that space where it's all this stuff just stems from unresolved trauma in some capacity in the past, and not putting in the effort, like the internal work, and just trying to unpack some of that and be kind to yourself and slowly evolve and whatnot. And then that just manifests in all these different ways. Right. And I don't know. I mean, I assume that it's kind of always been like that in varying degrees, as you know, as we've been here as a species, as humans, I guess you could say. But I wish, I wish we would I wish we would teach ourselves earlier in the journey about some of these reflective practices or ways to go inwards, and not, have to follow essentially the default path of getting to this crazy moment, and just like your backstory, where like life explodes and you're forced to do something, right? Or you get to this point, and then everyone hits it at different parts of their in different parts of their journey. But a lot of people, it's later on, and it's like, well, then it feels like you've wasted, this whole, the first half of your life in a way. So I don't know. I just wish, again, coming back to, I guess, full circle, how we started the conversation, like coming back to that intuitive uh sense, as well as like how we were born. Like, we're born curious and asking the questions. It's the only way we would reach and grab a table to stand up for the first time or whatever. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be walking, we wouldn't be doing things we do. And then as we get older, that curiosity seems to get pushed down and pushed down, and then we get into this autopilot situation where we're on other people's agendas and told, like, this is right, this is wrong, and so forth. And if you don't stop that at some point to I guess even take a look at your own belief systems, like, I was born into this set of beliefs. It may have served you, but may not serve you anymore. And like, do we want to upgrade those? Well, we don't ask those questions typically until, like I said, until there's some sort of big explosion moment. And I don't know. I don't think we need to get to that point.
This episode of Traveling to Consciousness is brought to you by Revive CBD. Now, I know what you're thinking, another CBD product, and typically I would completely agree with you. I've gone through all my trials and tribulations with CBD products, but this CBD cream is unlike anything else. Honestly, I don't know what it is, but there's something in the technology of it that it helps absorb into your skin and actually get to the place that aches and soothes your muscles almost instantaneously. It's close to instant. It's probably about a 5 to 10 minute activation that I've noticed, but sometimes it goes a little bit quicker. And so I know it can be difficult for find the right one, and this was my personal favorite that I found after long enough. I don't want to go back to that dark time, but I found it. It works amazing, and the creator of it is an incredible guy. So I highly recommend you click the sponsors link below, click on the Revive CBD tab, and get yours today. Revive CBD. Feel better, live better, all premium, all natural CBD products. Yeah. It's definitely a series of events that I've been trying to unpack for myself. And part of me, in order to calm my mind, part of me says, oh, it's just too grand for me to even know. Right.
Yeah.
And even kind of like, as you're saying there, that energy is kind of the same energy as like, why wasn't I told meditating when I was a kid? Why wasn't I taught about finances? Why wasn't I taught about, the inner dynamic political issue, whatever it is. Right. And there's part of me that tries to like take a step back and look at it from like a bigger picture. And the first place, or the thing that's coming to mind right now, is the idea of karma, right? And I try to look at this in the lens of, even if it was 100 years ago, right? Because through death and rebirth, through past lives, I'm sure, I would assume at least majority of us, however it works, right? We could have had a life 200 years ago. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, what's the purpose of that? Because 200 years ago, I mean, if you were in the Western civilization, right? I highly doubt there were very few people talking about meditation, mindfulness. It was more about basically just operating from a lower frequency, if you will, from the lower. I look at it in terms of chakras, right? Like from like fear or scarcity. I mean, I know I don't have to look further back than 2 generations in my family tree of scarcity, hoarding money, hoarding things. Things are going
Hmm.
to run out, things are going to go scarce. And again, this probably just goes back to that cyclic nature, right? The Great Depression happens, and then you have a world wars, and then so all of this kind of just gets embodied in the subconscious mind of humans. You have kids, and then they pick up on that energy, they model it, they rinse and repeat. And
Yeah.
so there is a piece of me that sees it as a couple things. I mean, maybe there's, people in the spirituality community label these as star seeds, where they kind of already see these patterns, and then they're helping others to try to heal the generational trauma or break those molds. And so then they are able to shine a light in a dark place in order for people to move forward or to come to a place of more alignment or fulfillment. And it seems to me like maybe that's just like the ebbs and flows of it. Maybe you need to get to a place in your karmic cycle or whatever it is where you see that polarity nature, the polar nature of, Earth, if you will, and then find a way to continuously go on that journey of avoiding the operation from those lower frequencies, if you will.
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I don't have the answer, and I think I don't think there is a right answer. I think we're all on our own path in some capacity. Um, just for me, I guess what comes to mind is just really doing everything possible to just slow down and ask the questions. Like, even with those cycles, right? Like, do I want to keep this cycle going, or would I be interested in shifting it, for whether that's for yourself or for your kids? Immediately, what immediately comes to mind is just our health in general, right? There's so many. I worked with a group of integrative medicine docs out of Houston a few years back, and we just learned so much. We interviewed so many different experts across the health space, and kept coming back to this thing, like where it's like, because we hear the language all the time, like, well, it's diabetes is like in my genes, or cardiovascular disease is like, it's just my dad had this, my mom had this, and it's just inevitable, and it's like we just give up almost. Whereas there is another route, if you're willing to ask the question and be curious about it, right? Like, well, what is it? It's not sometimes there's genetic factors, but from the research and from the interview series we did, most of the time it's the environment that then programs the disease and so forth, right? So it's like, if you change the environment, then you change the outcome. And the thing is we don't notice that if we just continue down this whole, like, again, this like people mover situation, or autopilot. And it's like, oh, well, I always grew up eating these kind of foods and with these kind of belief systems, and you just keep going and keep going. But it doesn't have to be like that. And to me, this is why I get so obsessed with just good questions, because I think the questions give us the pause, or the opportunity to take a pause and go down a different route. And if we can just all take time to and it doesn't have to be complicated, just kind of two fundamental things, like, who am I right now? And answering that question without any self-judgment or anything like that, just what's true right now, and who am I striving to become? And typically I don't think people would answer that second question with, I'm striving to become sick, or I'm striving to become irritated or upset, depressed, anxious. I mean, that's I haven't heard someone answer it in that case, at least up until this point. So if that's true, well, then, are the things I'm doing, the practices, the rituals, the people in my life, the way I'm looking at life, are they supporting that destination, or are they actually supporting the other track, which is leading me farther and farther away from that person I want to be. So I think if we just, this is what I mean by like, if some of these, whether it's meditation or other practices, they all help raise that self-awareness and, like I said, kind of clear out some of that mental clutter and free up some real estate in our minds. But if we can start with just checking in with ourselves and asking those questions to get clear on like where we're heading, and knowing that that's going to adjust and evolve as time goes, then at least we have a starting point of making some changes and whatnot, right?
Absolutely. And something that you were continuously alluding there, which if people aren't aware, it seems like, yeah, I don't know if you'd call it your brand, but something that you're very fascinated with is the asking of good questions, or even like what makes a good question. I mean, your whole book, Personal Socrates, was all about how do we become our own Socrates, if you will. And so there's a lot of questions that I have in regards to this, but let's start off with like, maybe what, like, where did you realize that was this power in questions?
Well, I had to live it. And maybe maybe I'm going full circle my own statement of like not doing everything possible to not hit those like big blow up life moments, because I mean I hit it myself, but it didn't feel good. But I came out the other end feeling
Is
very
this with the
aligned.
app? Is this
Yeah,
with the app, the
yeah,
KYO?
yeah, exactly. And I'll provide a bit of flavor to that, but basically that's when I had to really live the power of questions, because I had left a corporate career after being in these various roles in the corporate world for about a decade, and just had this desire to create a journaling app, which was KYO or Keo. And we did so. We reached a bunch of people doing so, nearly 90 million people in the first couple of years. If just for a visual or example, like just think kind of, some of the meditation apps like Calm or Headspace, just think about that flow or sequence, but specifically to help people start a journaling practice, leveraging questions. But even at that point, still Clayton, at that point, I wouldn't say that I was as tuned in to the power of questions. Even though I was collecting them, interviewing people, we had an app powered by questions, essentially. It wasn't until the moment where, despite reaching all those people, our business model wasn't working and we had to shut the app down. And it was in that moment when everything kind of came crashing down mentally, and my own mind started to self-destruct, because there was a lot of identity wrapped up in that product, in that business, especially having left the career that wasn't a situation where I was burnt out or not happy going into work. It was more of, I would regret not trying this if I don't leave and do it. And if it all fails, I can always come back to a similar role, which it failed financially, succeeded in many other ways, but the biggest challenge was that I no longer felt aligned going back to the industry that I had come from. But I had no plan or path forward now, since I just shut that company down. And that's when a mentor of mine, and someone I'm proud to say is on the cover of the book, Personal Socrates, with his blurb, Chip Conley. That's when he answered an email where I was asking for some feedback and advice, and he just said one thing, and he said, "What do you want for your life?" And it was that moment that paused my own mind, from which I knew I could feel it, and I knew the signs, having worked in the mental health space prior as well. I was heading into a deep depression, and it was that question that gave enough of a pause to think about, well, if this is what I truly want, then what do those days look like? Who do I need to speak with? Like, what's one step to getting closer to that? And then coming back to those reflections as soon as my mind would loop again, because it was constant battle, and it still is. I mean, I think that's, I guess, probably part of our us being human, and the fact that our biology isn't upgraded to the real threats of our modern day world, right? We're for the most part not in a survival state or survival situation, even though our minds are often in that state. So that was the first time. That was the first time that I really felt the power of a question and kind of came up with this idea. This is on the back of the book. I believe this. I really do believe that we're all one question away from a completely different life, which was that situation for me. But then also on a less grandiose, narrative or side of things, we're one question away from a completely different mood. If we just, flip in some gratitude prompts in a moment of fear or anxiety, you can immediately shift. So yeah, so like, I guess tying it all together to everything we've been speaking about, the through line for me is really just this power of giving ourselves and others the opportunity to pause and let our minds breathe a little bit and think and ideate and be curious and just, kind of follow those threads instead of just being on autopilot, or being on the production line and just not thinking.
This episode of Traveling to Consciousness is brought to you by Aquarius Mushrooms. And Aquarius Mushrooms creates what I can only describe as these fine art sculptures that are all one of a kind, and these plush mushroom fabric sculptures. They're what I would describe as being like little trip buddies. They're perfect for anyone who has a room that is dedicated to spiritual adventures, or anyone who is looking for a fine piece of art that is one of a kind. I think I said that, but one of a kind to enhance their psychedelic experience. I'm sober and I look at mine all the time, and it just oozes out this creative and spiritual energy that it's hard for me to stop looking at sometimes. And so if you are on even maybe just smoking some weed, like, I can only see how this thing would open up a portal to a new world. So I highly recommend that you click the sponsors link below, scroll down where you see Aquarius Mushrooms, click their website, and see if any of them speak to you. Because if it does, I can only imagine how it's going to speak to you in the real world. Aquarius Mushrooms, mushrooms for the new age of enlightenment. So it sounds like you kind of feel as though that's where the deepest truth lies then, or the deepest place that we can find answers is in that pause.
Yeah, I think so, because if you don't pause, you just carry on, right? Like and I haven't found an example yet where I would rather pick the autopilot. Like even in, I mean, there's maybe mundane tasks and whatnot, but like if you think of the big buckets and the big aspects of life that most of us are concerned about or put attention to, our relationships, our health, like just those two alone. If you put your relationship on autopilot and you're not stopping, you're not checking in with your partner or your best friends and family, that's when stuff just starts to spiral out of control. And you're like, how did we get here? I just put something up on social the other day, and I've got a newsletter coming up about it. I had a good conversation with Diego Perez, really awesome writer and poet. And we were just talking about, we kind of went through our own journeys of when our lives changed, and we were both married at the time and still are, but we were like, we're completely different people from the people we were 5 years ago. And thankfully our partners also evolved with us as well. And we had, and we're like, well, why? Like, what? Because it could have been, and I'm not saying either are good or bad. I mean, in our case, we wanted our marriages to remain and succeed, but it took time of stillness and asking ourselves some questions like, what do I want? What do you want? And what do we want? Because we're complete, like, we're going from a stable corporate paycheck where, we're every month we're putting stuff aside. We're going to do this vacation this year too. I have no idea what's happening right now. I'm a full on entrepreneur and the business just blew up. And I know I want to stay in this space, but what's the how, or what does that path look like? I'm not sure right now. Like, are we in this together or not? And those are very different circumstances from at least when my wife and I met, right out of university. So, that's one example just on relationships, that if you don't, if you just kind of let let these relationships just chart their own path, and you don't check in, they can lead to a place of, that's not actually what I want. And same thing with our health and nutrition, right? Go into a grocery store or supermarket and just don't think and walk through the aisles. You're toast. There's no way you're coming out of that place with a shopping cart full of healthy choices.
Oh yeah, I get you.
Impossible, right? Right.
Yeah.
So it's just, so I guess that's why, like, I've just failed to find a situation when it comes to those big life buckets where autopilot thinking actually leads us to a place where, we're thriving.
Well, so then, because this is interesting at the end there, where we were kind of talking about not thinking, but there's an interesting, I guess, dilemma here, right? Because we're talking about autopilot and not thinking, but then there's also the space without thought, right? So those almost feel like two different things. So is there like would the ideal place not to be to make the autopilot that space without thought?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Well, first of all, I want to make sure I understand the question. Are you saying that if you're on autopilot, essentially you're not thinking in that, essentially that space? Like, what do you mean
Well,
by the
so I guess
question?
thinking, the phrase thinking is an interesting one, right? Because when we say that we're on autopilot and not thinking, we have a tendency to just have these random thoughts going throughout our head, right? It's almost like this uncontrolled uh, monster, if you will, that's just spewing out, like a parrot almost, just spewing out the thoughts of the day, worries, fears, complaints, whatever. But like the space of no thought is almost more of being present with like the current moment. So it's almost, so it's interesting, right? Like there's a difference here, because if you're not paying attention, you're not giving thought to the current situation. But if you're being completely
Yeah.
present, you're almost still without thought in that moment.
Yeah, I think those are different situations. I agree. It's like when you're going for the run or whatever it is, or you're in the shower and that's like these ideas pop or these things come up because you're essentially not trying to think about things and so forth, and you're just going through, I guess, the motions of that activity. I like in those situations, I mean, well, and what's happening there obviously is that, we're giving our minds enough space and stillness to actually form those connections internally in our minds to surface those ideas. I mean, that's in its simplest terms, that's what's actually happening. I guess the difference to me though is maybe it's when you're on autopilot, when you're on someone else's autopilot. I think that's probably the distinction, right? When you're on the supermarket's autopilot, which is on the autopilot of end caps and marketing, that that isn't a place where I want to not be thinking. If I'm in nature and I'm just walking through and I just want to be present and so forth, sign me up for that all day long, right? Because I guess I trust that source. So maybe it's that. Maybe it's identifying the trusted autopilot sources that you want to be a part of. And I just, unfortunately, we're not set up to succeed or thrive in most situations outside of beautiful walks in nature or time in silence with our own minds.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating situation, and it has me thinking about even just the concept of making money, because like you're saying, people have made billions of dollars off of cereal, but that positive imprint that it's leaving on the health of people is not a very good one. And it was also interesting because I kind of started breaking this down all like even at a deeper level of like how many ways you can almost find fault within uh like certain avenues of really anything. I don't know, have you ever seen the show The Good Place
Yes.
on Hulu?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
spoiler alert for anyone who's watching or hasn't seen it. So skip ahead if if you're gonna see it. Um, but like in that show, right, the core concept was is that nobody had made it to heaven in I don't know, like almost forever, because of how intertwined our world has become with, if I buy if I buy a water bottle, right, it's made from child labor in China or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. And so because I'm now funding child labor in China, I'm getting deducted like 50 points off of my morality score. And so
Yeah.
it's interesting when this kind of is coming up, because I was thinking about this recently, is like it becomes this interesting conundrum of like this like divine way to almost, and I don't want to put it just at the feet at making money. I guess making money was the way that I thought about it, but it seems like it's almost become more difficult to do something that's self-righteously beneficial to society without causing too much of a negative impact in the wake of it, if that makes sense. And I don't know, I could be overthinking it, but that was kind of like where I was at recently, like thinking about this dilemma between, am I actually helping, society elevate their consciousness, live a healthier life, or am I actually contributing to fear, shame, guilt, and all that stuff?
Well, yeah, I think the most important thing you said in that statement, or one that stuck out for me, was like the idea of, am I overthinking it? Because I think we can overthink all of this. Like realistically, you and I, knowing you and our conversation even prior to this one, like we're doing everything possible to help as many people through our training and modalities and whatnot. But at the same time, yeah, like if I just look around with the technology in this booth, I don't know the source of all of the stuff, and I'm sure there's some really shady stuff going on, maybe with the components in this microphone and the chips in this laptop and so forth. And that doesn't sit well with me, but at the same time, I feel like I think we just need to do the best we can,
Yeah.
and at one point, because we'll just never get anywhere. And I don't know. I mean, I guess we're just flawed humans, or by default in some capacity. And I don't know in the animal world if it's if they're up against the same thought patterns in their own specific ways. I'd love to know that. But we definitely, as humans, come to the table with some nasty stuff and some flawed characteristics or traits and whatnot, but also a ton of beauty as well. And I don't know, I think if we can just, it comes back to presence for me. Like everything, no matter who I've studied, or the deeper I go into any of these practices, it feels like the magic is really just getting closer and closer to just the present moment and tapping into that intuition and like being here right now, doing the best we can, of course, and knowing and acknowledging that it's not going to be perfect.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it's probably something also along the lines of like that intention that you're carrying into it, right? If you're saying to yourself, I'm doing the best I can with this, then it's not likely that the consequences of your action is going to lead to child labor in, China or any of these other countries, if you will.
Yeah. Well, and you can take, I think, like I know my wife and I, we've done a lot of this just in our home with like the products that come in and whatnot. It's, again, it's not perfect, but we do try to ask the questions and do a bit of research on, okay, well, I don't know, is this the cleanest product? Is this being, you know, made in a sustainable way with a group of humans that seem to be doing the best they can, for example? And it's not, it's not always just a cut, like a yes, no, it's probably somewhere in between. But in many cases, I'm like, well, I know that the option we have now for, I don't know, our toothpaste or our fruits and vegetables is better than what it was, a few years ago. And could it be better than that? Of course. But, we're making progress. And I think, Tony Robbins says a lot this often, the key or the secret to happiness is just the sense of making progress. And I really do feel into that,
Mm.
whether that's progress with ourselves personally or progress with our business or something we're working on. And just, even the smallest little steps of progress just makes us feel like, okay, I did some good today. And if I can do a little bit more tomorrow, even better. And if I can be very present while I'm doing that, and see the things that are coming up, I'm like, oh, there's my tribe. Like those are the people, I want to be around, or like, that's the idea. Then it just, I don't know, just, you feel better. And everyone's
Yeah.
experienced that, right? Everyone's had some sort of version of being almost like in a flow state where time slows down and just feels like everything's going your way. And we've all experienced the opposite. And typically, the opposite is usually linked to those fear emotions and the looping anxiety thoughts and comparison. It's usually the things that we've been talking about that, we're trying to distance ourselves from, or that, the autopilot puts us on. So I guess my point with the questions is, it's a way to just, again, pause and just check in with yourself to make the realization, right? And perform a bit of a self audit of like, okay, well, what's going on here? And it's not good, it's not bad. It's just like, do I at least know what's going on? Do I have some data that I can work with personally?
Mm, right. Are there some sort of metrics that I can measure this with?
Yeah, well, just even, it doesn't have to be, complicated on a spreadsheet or a tracking app or anything like that. But just right now, I don't feel great. What's fueling that emotion? Is it something specific, or is it something, that I can shift immediately? I don't know, but there's usually something fueling, the reason why we're not feeling great. And it could be a million different things, but if we don't stop and ask that question, we'll never know. And then all of a sudden that feeling of not so great becomes the default. And this is what I mean when it comes back to, then all of a sudden we don't realize when we get to this point where we're like, now I really don't feel good. But that's been like, there's been micro moments leading up to this, right? It's like when your shoulders and your neck start to get sore. um Sometimes this is a posture thing, of course, and like, where, your desk set up or whatever, but often that's usually mental stress that's now physically showing up. And I invite everyone listening to, next time that I know, for me, when it comes up, like, okay, I've been stressing about this one thing and it's physically manifesting now. So let's let that go, and then hopefully next time it doesn't get to the point where there's physical signs and I can catch it, where I'm like, okay, there's that loop again. Let's deal with it. It's not about pushing emotions down or anything like that, but let's either release them in whatever practice or ritual that you have that you can do so, and let's rechannel it and replace it with, some excitement.
This episode of Traveling to Consciousness is brought to you by the official Traveling to Consciousness app, available on the iOS and Google Play Store. On this app, you're going to get exclusive content, from articles to meditations to anything else that Clayton is going to put out. Here's also where you're going to find the only place to find the ad-free versions of the podcast. You're also going to be able to get the podcast at earlier dates than normal, the free release version of it. So the Traveling to Consciousness podcast app, I highly suggest that you download it, because it's the only way that I suggest that you listen to it. And what's even better is that the company is always making updates, so please let me know if you personally have a recommendation and we can get that in there. So remember, download the Traveling to Consciousness app so that you can get early releases, you can get the video format, you can get it ad-free, and so much more.
So do you then have some sort of daily practice that you do with regards to questions or journaling that helps you to keep you out of this place of just sitting in that habitual routine, or that feeling of stagnation, or some way to reflect on your progress? Because that seems like also another big topic of interest, and something that I think it would help others, because I know I've seen it in my life, where if I don't have like that data or the metrics showing me that things are increasing, then it's kind of deflating. All right. If the numbers aren't
Yeah.
going up, of downloads or whatever, then you're like, ah, shit, am I doing something wrong? But then, with that being said, there's also a part of me that says, okay, even if the number of downloads went to 1 per month or 0 per month, would you still be doing what you're doing? And there's a piece of me like, yeah, I mean, I feel like I need to make a disclaimer to the guests, but for the most part, I'd be like, yeah, like I would still be doing what I'm doing. So I feel like that was a lot right there. I'm curious about your routine.
That was
Yeah.
a great question. I mean, how great of a check-in question is that for a journaling flow, right? Like, if you just, for anyone, like right now, take a look at the activities or the projects and even the relationships as well that are taking the most amount of your energy, and ask, and pose the question that you did, like, if whatever metric that you're seeking, if those metrics weren't there, would you still be putting that time of that energy into X, for example? And it's not to say that if you say no, you have to make this massive adjustment, but again, at least and maybe when something else comes up, now this, you've spent the time, you have that data in your mind that, like, okay, remember I thought about this, like maybe this thing that I can see now, this opportunity, is a good replacement for this project that I know maybe is not fully aligned, for example. So it's just, yeah, it's that clarity. I mean, the recipe I continue to see over and over again, no matter who I'm studying, is this idea of, we first have to get clear, then intentional with the things that we're doing day in, day out. And that's kind of all you have to remember, because that, what happens by default after, is that there's an expansion of possibility, because you start to see the path, the right people show up and so forth, and you start feeling better and better. And in order to get to that recipe or flow, at least what I've seen work, and personally what I do is just prioritize my mental fitness every single day. And just to define mental fitness for everyone, my version of the definition is just anything that you do to train your mind to work for you instead of against you, is my idea of being mentally fit. And it's the same thing as physical exercise. There are a million different things that you can do to move your body and strengthen your muscles and so forth, and ensure that you're flexible and you can move and all of that. It's the same thing with the mind, right? You mentioned meditation. Journaling is definitely my staple or foundational practice. But I would argue it's most people's, because if you expand the definition of journaling to just be its reflection, because that's the actual practice behind journaling, we're all reflecting. It's just, are we reflecting with intention or not? We're all asking questions. It's just, are we asking deep questions, or questions that get us below the surface or not? Right. So we all journal. I've done everything possible to incorporate the journaling, whether that's in the morning, to kick off the day and just kind of release what's circulating in the mind. And that might be through some free writing, or in the middle of the day when feels like things are a bit stagnant, or I haven't heard from someone on the emails. If I, proposed a project or tried to pitch a guest or something, and I'm starting to feel like that discouragement creep in, like, well, did I write the right email? Did I say something? Like all the fictitious, narratives that many of us craft for ourselves come up with me as well. And then in that moment, I'll just, whatever's in front of me, whether it's digital, whether it's a notebook, or, the back of a book, just reflect on a question like, well, what's in play right now? And there's a whole bunch of stuff that I can look at and be like, hey, these are great. I've had these meetings today that were really inspiring. I'm excited for tomorrow's projects and so forth. And for me, it's a good way to shift perspective in the moment. So the morning, though, is critical, because the morning for me is the training ground of having the self-awareness for when those moments come up in the day, so that I don't just continue to plow through and stew in those emotions, to just, again, pause and take a moment, literally a minute, maybe less than a minute, to just reset the mind. Wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't for, the years of mental fitness that is just helping at least me become more and more self-aware. And right now, the way that shows up, and I say right now because it always evolves, The key, in my opinion, is just to prioritize at least some amount of time, even if it's 10 minutes, the first thing you do when you get up, towards putting your mind in a inspired, motivated, and happy state. And now for me, that looks like more so of an hour and a half, depending on what's going on. And it's a mix of usually some breath work, and again, kind of depending on the mood, maybe I'll do some guided breath work that'll relax me or amp me up, for example. So I'll just kind of follow the intuition on that. But breath work has been a big one for me. Then I'll typically do a little bit of journaling, move my body, for sure, get in some physical fitness, exercise, spinning, weights, stretching, like again, it doesn't matter what it is. It's as long as there's something. And then I'll flip it and just set some intentions for the day. How do I want to show up today? How do I feel today? Where do I feel that in my body? And that's usually stacked into, as the coffee is dripping, I'll ask those questions. And I kind of have it's almost like a little sanctuary set up in a way right beside the coffee machine, because I enjoy the mindfulness of a good quality, fresh cup of coffee in the morning. So I enjoy the smell of that and the sound of it. For me, I do a pour over, and just that whole experience of the beans and so forth. But I ask those check-in questions, and then there's always a book leaning up against the wall in that area, usually something around Stoicism, often a lot of Ryan Holiday's books. The Daily Stoic was up there for probably about 10 years. And I just read a page. And again, it's always a perspective shift. No matter what's going on, at least in my mind, if I woke up happy or if I woke up anxious, just reading that one bit of positive mental nutrition can flip your mind. So that's the goal. So, what happens in that time period changes. And sometimes there's instead of the breath work, I'll do some meditation, or instead of the gym workout, I'll just take a long walk, or I'll put on a podcast that I know will be inspiring, or I won't put anything on and just take a silent walk. But the key is just, the question, I guess, would be like, what are 5 to 10 things that you can do that will put your mind in a good state, and just have that as your toolkit, and ensure that you're doing those things on a daily basis. Not all of them, but that you have, at least one of those things built into your routine. And then even best yet, when kind of shit hits the fan in the day or something throws you off, you can default to that list. Be like, hey, I just need to do this thing, instead of letting your mind take over, and then your whole day or days are hijacked because of that emotional state.
This episode of Traveling to Consciousness is brought to you by Mushy Love. Mushy Love is a latte type blendable mushroom caffeine free elixir that honestly tastes like a liquid cinnamon roll. And I know that you're going to find that on their website, but it's honestly true. It's stacked with more than twice the amount of mushrooms as any other mushroom latte. And I know that there's one in particular that we all think about, which kind of starts with the word mud, but this one blows that one out of the water. I highly recommend, if you even try that one, to just give this one a shot. And I promise you that you will not be sorry, because I just, it's so good. It's honestly so good. And I want to get to a place where I can actually they send me these all the time for free. So please go and buy it, because if you buy more, then they'll start sending me more. And it's just honestly a win-win, because it tastes amazing, like even in water. So even if you're cutting, even if you don't want to like put milk or coffee with it, you can just do it plain in water, and it's so freaking good. Guys, go click the sponsors link below, scroll down to Mushy Love, buy your pack today. Remember promo code Clayton, I can't even talk right now, promo code Clayton at checkout for 10% off your purchase. Mushy Love. Mushrooms shouldn't have to taste like mud. Give yourself some Mushy Love.
Yeah, I know I have certainly been doing a lot more stuff like that, with having like that list of things that can get you into that different state, such as like jumping up and down, celebrating small victories, jumping in a cold shower, singing, dancing, And it feels kind
Music's
of weird.
huge, right?
Yeah, but it feels kind of weird too, because you're not really used to doing it. And then you're right, because you're like physically changing the energy within your body. Like you're consciously changing the energy within your body, as opposed to leaving it up to almost the universe, if you will, for the universe to change it. And so it's kind of interesting. Like it feels kind of weird, but at the same time, you can tell what you're doing is somewhat beneficial for the outcome of your day, or even the task you're about to try to jump into.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, for me, there isn't a more kind of beautiful state or feeling, at least for me, to start the day off on my own terms.
Mm.
And, sometimes that hour and a half, I've got 2 young kids, and they don't always sleep super well, which,
They're not going to just sit and wait for you.
Yeah. So that could completely rock that routine. But on those mornings, maybe I'll do something, and this happened recently. I did 5 minutes of guided breath work, and just that 5 minutes put me in a state of feeling like, okay, I'm starting the day on my own terms now, versus if I hadn't done that, this has happened before, where I'm like, okay, no, I'm already behind. I'm going to, start the day. And that's the key word. You feel behind all day. And that affects everything. It can affect your sleep, right? And you can go to bed feeling anxious, or, you didn't check everything off the to-do list, and so forth. And again, it just keeps coming back to this idea of like not thinking and just kind of plowing through and autopilot the day and get this done, get that done. And then I need to go to sleep. And next thing you know, it's just this pressure that builds up in your mind and your body. And that has to release at some point. So I think that's the key, is just find the things that work for you. And, full circle to how we started the conversation, just be open and experiment, like coming back to your triangle, like, be open to all these different things. Like, what is the
It's actually
worst
a
case
pyramid.
thing?
It's a pyramid.
Yeah.
Please
Pyramid.
get it right.
Sorry. Yeah,
I'm
sorry.
just fucking with you.
The pyramid,
Yeah.
like, just the intention that you're setting by having that set up is beneficial. Not to mention like whatever energetic properties are going on.
Well, that's also the fascinating thing, I think, that usually occurs. And even with the pyramid, it's always like, what I think my brother asked me this, because I showed him a picture of it, and he's very analytically minded. And he was like, okay, so like, how do you know it's not just your mind that's making yourself feel better when you're in it? And I'm like, hey, it's completely possible. It's 100% mental. But I guess it comes back to that aspect of like, if you believe something to be real, then it becomes real. And where does that line kind of exist? And I guess it comes back to just trying it, right?
Yeah.
Watch the, like, in, especially from an energetic state, go watch the news for an hour and don't take your eyes off the television. Like, you will feel fear, shame, guilt, blah, 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 blah. And then go dance, sing, run around, do that for 30 minutes. And you tell me how you feel differently, right? It's like,
Totally.
oh, well, I could just think my way into that, or I could just think my way out of that. And again, there's probably some truth to that, right? Like, if you're watching the news, you could see it from a higher level perspective and just see the fear and find the fear funny. But there's still that interaction of the mind with the physical world that makes the thing, if you will.
Yeah. Well, just run your own experiment. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
I say to anyone that, questions really any of this stuff. Well, I'm not here to push any agenda or narrative, other than the fact that I think we all deserve to feel as good as possible, and that we all deserve a healthy mind, and definitely more days than not. And statistically speaking, that's not happening across the world, at least in North America right now. So, that's my message. But if journaling's not for you, or if sitting under a pyramid is not for you, then try your thing and test it. And to your point, like, just be super practical. I mean, you might be above the fear of the news, but are you, did you check in after, and did you try that for 5 days and then, journal on like, what are the dominant emotions right now? Did you track the day and see, okay, well, what actually played out? I'm willing to put money on, if you did that you would see some pretty scary patterns emerging and unwanted patterns with behavior and outcomes and so forth, just from watching the news like that. And even coming into it thinking that, all right, I'm just trying to get the headlines, which is even worse, but I'm just trying to understand what might be going on in the world. There's really nothing you can say about the news that's good. So I'm trying to reframe it, but it's not, there's nothing really that great about it. To your point, versus, doing things that, put a smile on your face and so forth. Even visualization. I mean, like, we accept that, with athletes. I've interviewed so many different athletes that are able to make themselves sweat visualizing, their race. I mean, there's power in it. Like, just try it.
Yeah. I know there's even studies that have been done in, scientific studies where people would just even mentally think about lifting weights versus like a control. And they were showing that even just thinking about lifting weights can show an increase in muscle mass just by you mentally saying to yourself, okay, I'm lifting this weight. I feel it in my biceps. Okay, now I'm kind of doing rows with my back, and even not even moving the physical body, but just by thinking about it, you're affecting matter. You're affecting the mass of your body, which is absolutely astonishing in its own rights, in my opinion. And
Totally.
I think they also even showed it with like piano players, like people who had never played the piano before, and then they just like showed them a video of someone playing the piano and then had people mentally rehearse it, and they were actually like, I don't know how exactly they did that one or tested it, but they showed an increase in people's ability to play an instrument through just mental rehearsal on its own rights.
It's fascinating, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and again, it's like, test this stuff out in a way that makes sense for you. Like, if I'm going to work with a team and train them on different mental fitness practices, or give a keynote or anything like that, I'll close my eyes and set the intention of how do I want the people on the other side to feel after this experience. And I still have not been proven wrong of getting to the end and like, oh, there it is. Like, because I feel it too. Right. So it's just prove it to yourself, and coming back to the idea of like, what's the worst that can happen? What I set a positive intention for the audience. I'll take that bet.
All right. Yeah, dude, let's but I don't know why my mind's pulling us back to it, but the Socratic method, because you mentioned it briefly in your book. Your book's called Personal Socrates. You brought up Ryan Holiday with The Daily Stoic. I've been reading a couple of his books, which is really great. The one I'm reading right now, well, we'll come back to it. But I found that interesting because you were kind of talking about how you kind of stumbled into the Socratic method, and I wanted to hear you kind of break it down. Like, so what is the Socratic method? Is it just asking questions about our lives? Is it something a little bit deeper than that? What's the Socratic method? How does it tie into Stoicism? Is it different? Like,
Sure.
what's going on with all that?
Yeah, I did fall into all of that a little bit by accident. It wasn't, there wasn't the intention to have a book titled Personal Socrates and grounded in any kind of philosophy or a Socratic method. It interestingly enough, seems like I was doing that naturally, and then it kind of materialized as, oh, well, yeah, I am actually following the Socratic method, and have noticed, in terms of the way I was studying the reflective questions that people were asking themselves across business and their personal life, that there was the Socratic method in there as well, which in its simplest or most general terms is really just asking a big question and following that up with sub questions to get closer and closer to the core answer you're seeking.
What
And
would an example of that be?
who am I is probably the biggest one you can ask. And who
It's a
am
pretty
I?
big one.
Well, yeah, well, it can be, and or it doesn't have to be. It can be, because it's big and it's scary if we label it with that kind of judgment, versus it could be, and I'm guilty of doing that myself. But now I would say, well, who am I is who I am in this moment. And okay, well, if that is true, then like, what are the dominant characteristics that I think make up Marc Champagne in this moment? And there's definitely some fundamentals that will continue to play forward, like being curious and, showing up with energy and so forth. But then, you start, what does that mean then? Like, what does it mean to be curious? How do I feel when I show up with energy? How do I want other people to feel with that? So it's just breaking it down further and further. And it originated with Socrates, and most people know of Socrates in some general capacity as a philosopher and the guy that asked a lot of questions kind of thing. That was my background. But when I started to really look into the Socratic method, that's when my own curiosity really sparked, because I was like, well, here's this method that primarily is used in an academic setting, or originated in an academic setting, where he would ask his students big questions. And then they would reply, and then he would ask more and more questions and so forth. And it was kind of more of a painful experience, but I think the core of the practice is designed to stimulate thought and get you closer and closer to, again, uncovering, okay, what is it at the core that you're trying to figure out, right? Like a who am I question, really, at the core of it, I think, is you can identify those characteristics of what makes you you, but it's probably all for the purpose of showing up and feeling good and feeling proud of the life that you're living, or feeling like you're making progress, or feeling happy. Like that's to me the core of it, of where we're trying to get with a who am I question. Like, what is it? What is it that would make me smile more days than not, for example? So anyway, as I continued down the path of Socrates, and just noticed that it's very much grounded in academics. It kind of has a little bit of a bad rap in terms of being aggressive with questioning. And, my best friend's a lawyer, so he went to law school and definitely was trained up on this method as well. And I remember those years. I'm like, can you just stop with the questions? Like, can we just get to the conversation here, or an answer? And that kind of is like the default, perception of this practice. But, kind of like what I mentioned earlier, like we're all asking series of questions. It's just, we're not typically doing it with a lot of intention. So I started to think, well, here's a method that has literally stood the test of time, because we all know something about it, and it's literally, hundreds, actually over 1,000, I think, years old. And so that's something there. How can I just modernize it so that we don't, have to get too caught up in the weeds of like, what kind of question is this? Is this an intentional, or is this a probing assumptions question? Because there's scholars that have tons of papers on all the different question types that make up the Socratic method. Who's ever going to remember or operate in that, in that realm? Like, it's just not feasible. And that's how the structure of the book came to be. And I've already kind of alluded to it. It's just questions to first help us get clear. Forget the who am I question. Like the question that anyone running a business, or working for a business, or working on a brand, you ask these ones all the time. Where are we at with the brand, and where do we want to be at the end of the year? Whether that's financial, whether that's, customers, brand perception, it's the same questions. Who am I? Who am I striving to become? Where are we at? Where do we want to be? Right? Same thing. So I was trying to, think of the easiest way to actually inject this into our regular, life and professional life. And that so far has shaped up in questions to get clear, then questions to probe our, intentionality and focus. Like, now that we know we're trying to go to this location, well, what needs to adjust? What habits do I need to shift, break, start? What systems need to be in play to actually get me closer to that destination? And this is where those check-ins come in, and just realizing, okay, well, what I'm doing today is not really in service of the people that I'm trying to serve, or the business I'm trying to build, and so forth. And then that third thing, again, just happens by default, that expansion of possibility and opportunity, because if you're clear and intentional, you just by default start blowing out all the noise. and you start seeing through, like, okay, there's that, there's that looping narrative, or there's that relationship that I'm probably going to lose energy in an interaction with that person versus gain energy. So maybe I'm not going to book some time with them today because I'm focused on what I'm doing. And then that's when, like, stuff just starts to happen. It's all there. It's always been there. It's just now you can see it, right? It's like taking your mind and organizing it like a beautiful library. Our minds are full of amazing knowledge and information. But if you're in the library and just like push all the bookshelves over and there's just stuff all over the place, it just makes it really hard to retrieve that information or make the connections. Versus this kind of like mental fitness and following prompts like what I'm mentioning, it's just a way to organize the mind. And then when stuff comes up, it's like, there it is, got it. Okay, I'm going to use this. Or if there's that emotion again, I've got this bag of tricks that I can use here to rechannel that. Right. So that's how it all came to be. And I mean, I have to give credit to my publisher and the founder of the company, Joey Cofone, because as I was explaining some of this with less detail, of course, because I hadn't really looked into Socrates much more than my general idea or notion of who he was and whatnot. But he immediately, Joey said, oh, well, that's the Socratic method. And then, then I went down the rabbit hole. I'm like, yeah, it actually is. And this is exactly what's surfacing in all these interviews. And then I think the next call we were speaking about a little bit more. He's like, you should really call, like, the book should really be titled Personal Socrates. And still at that point, I was like, absolutely not. I'm not a philosopher. I don't, like, that doesn't resonate. But again, like, the more I dove in, I'm like, wow, there's something here with that, because again, we're all asking these questions. And the biggest thing I want to leave with people is that we can be our own, coach in a way for our minds. We can have our own kind of personal Socrates sitting on our shoulder in a way that's productive and helpful for our own minds. And, it doesn't require, although these are helpful, but it doesn't require a 30-day silent retreat, to do this work. You can do it literally with one question, at any moment.
This episode of Traveling to Consciousness is brought to you by Conscious Technologies LLC. Talk about an aligned company name. This company creating technology that will revolutionize the way that humanity is able to resonate or vibrate with the electromagnetic frequency of your phone, of your Wi-Fi router, of the light bulbs in your house, of really anything. What they do is they have created these amazing minerals, amazing units that you can either place on the back of your phone, you can wear it as a necklace, or they even have like little in-house generators, if you will, that can unify the entire field of an entire house. I've experienced these things in person, and I unequivocally can tell you that it does something, and it helps you feel more present, more calm, and more connected to the spiritual dimension, if you will. And I highly recommend that you also check out episode number 034, where I actually talked to one of the co-founders, and it blew my mind away. One of my favorite episodes, where we actually get into how he creates it, why it's created. And, if this wasn't enough of a sell for you, go check out that episode, because I know that it will sell you after that. Conscious Technologies LLC, harmonizing the planet one person at a time.
And that's an interesting point you kind of bring up there at the end, which is like the idea of a coach and becoming our own coach. Or, I'm looking at this now in the lens of kind of Hinduism. And I brought this up a couple of times because I'm like reading some books about it. And they talk about like having a guru, and the point of a guru is to have someone who shows you the direction that you're trying to go, right? It's the same thing with like a coach. Learn from the people who are where you want to be and take their advice, because if they're on the path, they walk the path, take their advice, you go down the path further. How, like, where do you kind of see that balance in terms with what we're talking about here? Because kind of like what you're laying out, we're able to find a way using the Socratic method to be our own coach. We can, in the spirituality community, we can get signs from the universe. And it's always been this interesting dance of like, do you need a coach, or can you kind of just live off of your intuition and let the divine force within you kind of guides you. So I don't know, in your
Yeah.
experience, where do you feel like that kind of either balance, or just where do you dive into a coach, or just live off the intuition?
Well, I mean, I definitely live, or I guess my grounding philosophy or belief system and principles do follow off what you're saying, is just living off the intuition, and I do everything possible, whether it's journaling or breath work or any of these practices, to help refine that intuition and let that intuition come out. But then where the balance comes in is what at least for me, what happens is that the intuition surfaces insights and clarity, and then it becomes, okay, well, there's a very specific situation now that I may need some knowledge about, or some help that is very clear because of my own personal Socrates, but now I go to seek someone that's an expert, and that could show up in different ways. That could be, I'll spend a week on a topic listening to different podcasts of all, all types of people talking about a specific situation or topic where I'm trying to learn more about, or obviously, buy some books, or, go straight to, actual coaches and so forth, and mentors, and ask those questions to get clearer and clearer, and get some guidance from people, to your point, that have the wisdom and have come before us and done this, and that is woven. It's like we've forgotten about a lot of that, because that's woven into our culture. I mean, we've evolved from, the wisdom of our elders, and we don't spend that much time nowadays, at least in North American culture, um, learning and asking the questions, and asking about the stories, and asking about the life insights and lessons that, our elders have gone through, and so forth. And I think this is a way to seek that knowledge out.
Mm. Is to kind of just like look internally. And this also feels like something that kind of even ties back to kind of the meta steps that you've been laying out, and you break your book down into this as well, where it's like the get clear, live intentionally, expand possibilities. So where I'm really interested in kind of breaking apart all three of those things, right? Because I think, especially if we start from the ending where it says expand possibilities, to me, and in the day and age we're living, it reminds me kind of like the quantum field and quantum healing and quantum manifestation and quantum jumping and all that quantum stuff, because it seems like that world, that area of existence that we're starting to walk into as humans, it seems like that's where infinite lies, right? Is in this space of expanded possibilities, as you stated. And I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing based on my perception of it, but that's kind of like where this quantum field lies. So you almost are right. You're kind of the way I'm viewing it, and whether this is intentional or not, y'all get your voice on it. But it seems like it's the end goal is accessing expanded possibilities, which would be accessing the quantum or infinite field. I guess you could also see that as God in some ways, but maybe that's a little bit too religious. But walking backwards, right? It's like, to get to the expanded possibilities, we need to live intentionally. But if we're going to live intentionally, we need to get clear on our life and what we desire. So I'm not really sure what the question here is. The question here might be is like, where do you see the majority of people lie within this paradigm? Or are we always kind of traversing this paradigm? Are there certain parts of our being that are in certain areas of this paradigm? Like maybe my finances are still in the get clear, whereas with my relationships, they're already in the expanded possibilities. How do you kind of see this 3-part initiation or
Hmm.
series, if you will, um, as it being laid onto a person's life?
I mean, everyone's of course at different phases, and it really depends on the amount of work that you've already done to kind of place yourself kind of where you're at. But I think you can use that formula in really anything that you're doing in anything in your life. Like even writing the book, when I went against the formula, and I'll give the example of what that looked like, it was painful. So for example, it would be, I remember when I was writing Robin Williams' chapter, that one was really challenging. And I had a general idea of kind of what I wanted to cover with him and the angle to cover. And I just started writing. And then eventually it stopped. And I was stuck, and I stopped, and I just let it sit. And I came back, and it was painful, and I couldn't really get forward. And then I eventually realized, well, I'm not following my own advice in the process, because I've skipped right to part 3 of like expanded possibility, which essentially is, thinking clearly and be like getting right to the outcome in a way. And I didn't spend enough time on the outline. And in order to have a good outline, I needed to spend more time on the inputs and getting clear on who Robin Williams was, and having enough, like getting to the point, the whole book is written like this, getting to the point where intuitively I felt like, all right, I know enough that I can see the themes that I really want to cover here. And I might have to go back and go a little bit deeper on certain things, but now I feel like I've read enough, I've watched enough interviews, and I'm at that point. Now I'm going to put together an outline. I'm going to look at that. Is it structured in a way that I feel like I can take this and just go? And that's following the process. And what I see most often is that for the most part, many of us want to get to that outcome by skipping the first 2 steps. And it's, in a business setting, what normally comes up is like, I want to come up with the best innovation, the best ideas. I really want, I want to look at this, and even your life, I want to look at this from a lens of possibility, for example. But then you get there, and how can you possibly see from that lens if your mind is full of all of these circulating emotions and narratives and stresses, either personally and professionally, all of this stuff? It's nearly impossible for us to be asking the right questions. It's not, you can do it, but the chances of getting to a really clear, like, there it is, like that's the path, is nearly impossible. So that's why, for me, and a lot of this is coming from like, my corporate experience. For the most part, I was a brand and product strategist. And even when I work with people one-to-one on the mental fitness side, I don't consider myself a coach. I'm not a therapist. I consider myself a strategist. And it's really about getting clear on, just like you would a brand, like what's the vision that you're setting for yourself, and how do you want your mind to feel by the end of this year? And then let's take a look at the big pillars of your life and your work that support that, and then layer in the practices underneath those to make sure that you're putting the energy and the attention, and that's the focus, that's the intentionality. And then when that whole system is starting to flow properly, that's when stuff starts to surface, right? And that's when you can get to, like, some of the profiles in that section are, from big visionaries, like someone like philanthropist and entrepreneur Naveen Jain, where he's got a space company, a health company. He's trying to make chronic disease a choice instead of something that everyone's suffering with, as it is today. But to ask those questions and challenge the whole system, and then of course the challenges of going to space and so forth. You have to think from a lens of, imagine if this was possible. And when you answer those questions, when you've done the work and your mind is clear enough, then you start from a place of possibility instead of a place of lack. And most of the time, and I think many listening can resonate with this based on any kind of work that you're doing, when people bring up new ideas, usually the next line or the next narrative is something around, well, who's going to work on that? We don't have enough budget to cover this. We don't, and many of those things might be true, but don't start from that place. Like, start from,
Right.
full on possibility, then we can narrow it down and make it a little bit more realistic. But what happens when you start from the reverse perspective, you miss a whole bunch of different avenues and paths. And that's the point with the structure of the book. Like, you can apply that in any way, right? Like, just get clear, intentional, and then the magic happens.
Well, so then based on that answer, it sounds like it's almost a circular loop where, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but if you're looking at what my mind is saying is infinite possibilities, but what you would write would be expanded possibilities, would be that notion of, well, what if there is no more disease? What if we lived on Mars? What if, what if
What if
XYZ?
everything went right?
Yeah, what if everything went right? Right. So wouldn't that be the expanded possibility? And then, or is that still in the get clear section, or does that lead you to the get clear section? What's like that inner connectivity there?
Well, the interconnectivity is more so like anyone can pose a question, what if everything went right? And actually encourage people, when your mind is looping and you're in a stuck place, like, that's a great question to journal on that can flip your perspective. But where I'm going with this is that to get the best results and the clearest answers from answering a question like that, you're better off spending time clearing out your mind and getting clear with yourself and your intention of like where you are and where you want to be. Like, even what if everything right? Well, what is everything went right for you? If it's not linked to kind of where you're heading, then it's you're kind of rudderless, right? So it's like, set the direction first, and it's the context to, now this is how I'm going to answer this question, what if everything went right? It's naturally, you don't even have to think about it. You're gonna default to answers that will support that direction. But without the direction, then it's an interesting exercise. It'll definitely be beneficial, but it's not as powerful.
So you kind of need to have that North Star, if you will, in place before asking the question, what if everything went right? Like, you need to already
Yeah.
have the intention of starting a business to be I don't know, a publisher, if you will, and then say, okay, well, what if everything went right for me to be a publisher? And then you follow that pattern, at which point now you live intentionally to try to enact that pattern, if you will. Is that kind of how
Yeah.
you see it?
Yeah, because you spot it. You start seeing, because since you've set the intention and you're clear on your direction, and then when stuff comes up, you can spot the distractions versus the actual door openers to getting you closer to whatever you're trying to do in life and your work. Versus before, it might have been, oh, that's really interesting, very shiny, kind of fancy, opportunity, like, let's go with it. And there is something to be said to just explore and experiment. I'm not saying not to, to do that. I'm just saying, typically, the people that I've studied, and I've seen it myself as well personally, when we're clear and we have a very specific objective in mind for our life, and how we want to show up and the person that we want to be, then you start being presented with the avenues. And that's where I think, like, a lot of, when you're mentioning like quantum physics and stuff like that, and all, energetics and all, like, that's when you see this stuff. It's always there. It's just now you spent the time blowing out all of the roadblocks along the way. And like, you're no longer like trying to peek around the corner. It's right there. I'm like, okay, I need to go. And I've seen this show up as making decisions with, people to collaborate with or to partner with, or even the book, the book. And because I was at the point, where I was looking around, like, how am I going to publish this? Like, what's going to be the route? And, I got real clear on kind of the impact and the type of people that I wanted to work with. And then when Baron Fink came around, it was, he didn't even have to finish the question. It's like, yes, we're doing this together because this is the right partner. And I don't think I could have answered a question like that 5 years prior, having not put in a significant amount of work with these practices. You know, I've been doing them for probably a decade, but I would say I said 5 years, it's been 7. 7 years, time flies. It's the last 7 years since leaving the corporate world and really diving into this. Like I said, with, you know, coming back to that example with Diego Perez or Young Pueblo, his pen name, just different people, you know, and I see it as, it's exciting because it's fun to be able to play with these practices and these prompts and dream and you know, expand my own thinking and like get excited for the uncertainty instead of being fearful of it.
Yeah, it seems like you're, how do I want to articulate this? It seems like you're even able to, by going through this method, you're able to avoid self-sabotage in a way, because you've already mapped out the type of people you need to work with, who you need to get in contact with, who, like, what events need to occur, and what opportunities you need to say yes to whenever they arrive. And thus, by knowing that in advance, once those opportunities come up, it then becomes like a fuck yes, like this is it, this is the
Yeah,
opportunity, this is the person, as opposed to maybe it's this person, maybe, like, I don't really know, let me listen to my intuition, it kind of, sort of, because now you've already mapped it out, and then once they just arrive, it just becomes like a yes, as opposed to you needing to
totally.
sit there and think about it.
Totally. The biggest example I can use that's recent for me is this one. I when I was starting to prepare the marketing and the PR and whatnot for the book, well, at one point we recorded a book trailer, basically like a movie trailer essentially. And I remember I went into the city in Toronto and had prepared for it and loved the whole process. And then we filmed it. And I remember coming out, my wife was there with me as well. And I remember looking at her, I'm like, this was so much fun. The whole process of filming this trailer, like I've never done something like that. It was, you know, it was in a studio, like camera on these rails. And I'm like, this is so fascinating. And like about something I'm really passionate about. And I remember, you know, in that moment thinking, I'd love to do more of this at one point in some capacity, but I have no idea how is that ever going to materialize? So the book launches and we're about a year into it. And I started thinking about the next book, and, you know, I wanted to write something similar format, but just different category of people being covered. And I landed on musicians. So I really think, again, we all have those songs that can instantly move us. And I think there's a lot more to unpack with the minds of musicians from a mental fitness standpoint. So I wrote I took the book summary of Personal Socrates, kind of hit delete, and just wrote a mock book back summary, including quotes from magazines and stuff like that, the whole thing of what the next book's going to be. And I shared that with my wife. I shared that with about 5 or 6 other people. 100% of them said, interesting book, but I think it'd be even better film series. And right there, I was like, isn't that interesting? You know, it's been over a year since that thought or that feeling of recording the trailer, but this is it. And as we speak, no, I can only share a certain amount, but I'm in full on discussions with a film studio to actually bring a TV series or a film series to light on this topic, purely on the second book concept. So this is what I mean by getting, you know, but just like that clarity of thought when that came up, you know, there was a feeling there, and it imprinted in my mind, versus had I ignored the feedback from people and said, no, I really want to write the book. Like I really want to write that second book. I'm not sure what you're talking about. It was that connection point that gave me the pause to say, well, this is it. This is obviously a sign. And I don't think you can do that when your mind is so full and chasing, you know, any opportunity that comes through to get this work out. Because that also feels like, you know, like I said, I really want to get this stuff out there for people and make it accessible, but with intention. And
Right.
that's the example of that formula most recently playing out. And we'll see where this whole film thing goes. I mean, it's a really interesting space. You can go sideways about 100,000 times, within a day. But so far, it's going, it's progressing, and that's all I can ask.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely have questions about that, and maybe we'll save that for once it starts getting into play. And because I don't know what's inbounds. We've briefly talked about this, I believe, in our meet and greet. So I'll try to leave it. We'll move the conversation past it, and then once it gets made, we'll have you back on to talk about it
Yeah,
more
I
in
love that.
depth.
Thank you.
But kind of winding it back, right? Was the get, I guess, in regards to this, maybe we'll try to make it more meta. So you've seen this, I guess, then play out in multiple different ways throughout your life, where it was like this get clear, live intentionally, and then almost divine intervention. Like, is that kind of the way that you've seen this just happen time and time again in your life?
Well, divine intervention are super practical. Like, let's use health. You set a health goal, whether that's how you want to feel, weight. Maybe you're working to get rid of a. So here's an example for me personally. I was on, for the longest time, perfect example of being on autopilot. I was on these heartburn pills, PPIs, for like a decade. And it started in university from probably just not even, I wouldn't even say I wasn't super overweight or anything like that, but just not now that I know, like, just not a good diet, and not necessarily a whole bunch of spicy or fatty foods, but just not good quality food. And this went on for a decade. I moved several times, different cities, which meant changing family practitioners, family medicine docs. No one ever, just refill the prescription, to the point where finally, as I was on my own journey, I'm like, this can't be good. Like, and on any kind of long-term medication, and I'm pretty young, like, I don't want to be on this for the rest of my life. What do I like? Get clear on, like, what do I want? I want off of these meds. And then Socratic method. Well, what do I need to, who do I need to speak with to educate myself to get off of these? It's not going to be from the traditional medical system, unfortunately, because that's what's kind of put me in this position. And next thing you know, coming back to the example of those physicians I was working with them from a professional standpoint, but then they started to help me, saying, hey, we're going to put a personal plan for you to get off of these meds. So the intention was very clear. I want off of these. I want to feel good, and I want to have ownership of my health in a way. Because really, if I really think about it, I was being lazy and taking a quick fix on something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which unfortunately is a huge thing with most of the chronic illness that's out there. There's always another option. So in this case, did that, and then got real intentional with tracking the foods and going, on and off different elimination diets and gluten and dairy, and playing around with just different, foods and so forth to see what was happening. I was on a continuous glucose monitor. That was so eye-opening to just see even my wife's incredibly healthy homemade granola. I might as well have a Mars bar after eating that, in terms of the glucose spike that happens.
Right.
So it's just getting clear and like, okay, now I've got data to work with. I have an idea what's happening. There was a whole bunch of factors. And then eventually I was put on, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks of a pretty intense supplementation protocol while weaning off of those meds. Those 2 weeks weren't the greatest. Those were tough, but it's been 3 years now. I haven't had one of those pills completely off, and including any over-the-counter like Tums stuff. None of it. I've had no problems. So it's just like, that's again, and that the outcome of that to me is an expansion of possibility. It's just a different phrasing of it, like, because now, like, I feel a hell of a lot healthier. I feel like I know a lot more about my body and what I personally need from the combination of foods and what puts my body into an inflammatory state and so forth. Like I have so much more information there, and I'm not done. Of course, we're always evolving, but that's one example of that formula again playing out, versus just randomly trying a whole bunch of different things with, well, what is the objective to come off these pills? Is the objective to reduce them? Is it something else? Right. So just getting really clear and, kind of divine, intervention, like those, I didn't seek out those docs for my personal benefit. We started working together. I was their mental fitness strategist for their health offering. And it was around the same time that I set that intention. I'm like, I really want to get off these meds. And then next thing you know, one of those physicians saying, well, I'll help you do it, to the point where, we stopped working together. Our projects ended, and he's like, I made that commitment. I'm going to stick around with you for the next, 6 months, and we're going to get you off this stuff. And we're just texting him today. We're great friends still. So that's the stuff, right? Like, someone placed those people in my view, and because of the steps and the mental fitness, I was able to see, like, all right, let's do this. Like, this is exactly what I need.
It's really cool. And my mind's kind of going to this from a manifestation or spirituality perspective, where it seems like a lot of people, at least I'm maybe projecting where I used to be, and maybe I'm still there a little bit, it feels like, where it's like, okay, you have this goal and maybe you get clear on it, which would be part one of your whole thing, is like, get clear on that outcome, visualize it, feel it in your body. But then the next step, and this feels like where maybe I'm coming up short, and maybe other people are as well if they're listening to this, where it becomes that live intentionally piece. And it seems as though in the way that you're articulating this, it's almost that you need to break down that big goal for yourself, right? That might be the work, quote unquote, that needs to be done of, okay, if I'm thinking about myself right here, if I want to grow my podcast, like what needs to be done? Okay, you got to consistently update and upload podcasts. You got to have interesting conversations. You need to create things that are shared or shareable, and then even do visualization on all those little mini things as well. Don't just sit and look at that big picture and visualize that. It's like, okay, now break this down. Okay. You got the big goal. Now break down the big goal into little goals. Visualize those little goals getting executed. And then even break down those if you need to do that. And a quote that's kind of coming to me is that people want to help those who help themselves. And so it seems to me as though that's when, let's say the universe, God, divine intervention, the hand of source, whatever it is, that's whenever it comes in and does its part. It says, okay, you have this goal. I see you're visualizing it. I see you've broken down all those steps. You're executing on those steps. You're uploading that podcast weekly. You're finding more aligned guests. You're you're doing the process, all the steps. And then that's whenever it comes in and says, okay, here's the next piece of your puzzle. Okay, here's Mark. Let's talk to Mark. Here's him showing you that you need to take this big goal and maybe break it down a little bit more, and then focus on those intermediate steps. And then over time, you can look back on it and see the way that big goal was kind of broken down. And you almost, I guess you almost leave space for that last element to kind of come in. Does that sound like a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it that's what I mean. It happens that last space or component happens by default by putting in that intentional work. But the thing is, I think there's a couple elements. There are the puzzle pieces, and like, maybe our conversation is one of those things. But then there's also the other, things to visualize as well, because this will happen when you're trying things and it's not working, or you get hit with a big roadblock, what seems like a roadblock at the time, right? And even, visualizing those moments and putting yourself in that moment of, all right, I'm really clear. I'm visualizing like the outcome, or at least what I think the outcome is, the current desired outcome. Because the other really fun thing is that and you can test this, everyone has these situations. If you look at big projects or things that you're really proud of, you can reflect back and be like, I actually didn't plan for that. It came from something, right? Like my whole film thing came from the idea of a second book, but I definitely did not plan to be in full-on conversations with a film studio in LA right now. Not at all, right? But it started with that path. But then, so if you visualize though, because you're going to get thrown with those moments where you're thrown off track, and visualize yourself handling the emotion, so that then you have the mental capacity to see, okay, what is this little test? Like, what am I learning from this test? Like, why there's a reason for this, and what can I derive is the reason, so I can subtly adjust, right? So that's like, that would be the first thing. And then the second thing is just throughout, whether it's your project or anyone, the key is to continually check in with yourself, right? Like you're doing the actions and so forth, but are they working? Is there something that you can see, okay, well, this is working more than that, and now's the time to adjust the experiment, the experimentation, or adjust the plan and double down in this area, for example. And same, just since it's so fresh, I'll just continue to use the film project. Like, this first step for me was to start having conversations with people in that industry to understand, like, what does it take to put together a pitch? Like, even all the language is completely different. I was coming from, the startup space of the closest thing that resembles this would be pitching for investment for a company. But all of the language is completely different in that space. And it's, just, I've got a list of conversation or people that I've had conversations with, just to try to understand what's going on, and then constantly keep checking in to see, okay, this is what I've learned. This is I was going down this track, but based on these last 2 or 3 conversations, doesn't really seem like that's the right path. Like, now where? So the path is winding, but the mountain is still in the distance, or the peak is still over there, right? And it's those check-ins though that many forget to do, and then that's when you end up in a completely different mountain range. You're like, oh, I climbed something. It's not that you didn't climb something, but you climbed the wrong mountain. Typically, because we don't slow down to be like, to just check in, to subtly course correct.
Yeah, that was that's a big one right there. I know, even for myself and in my journey, right, with being a software engineer, I didn't get to the, let's say, the top of the software engineering pinnacle, but I was close enough where I could see the top, and that was whenever it was like, oh shit, this path isn't have what I was looking for in all of life. Like, now, I had what I called a quarter life crisis. And luckily it happened sooner than later. And so I was kind of just like, oh shit, like I was like, yep, this mountain isn't going to take me to the height that I internally know I want to go. And that's huge, man. I mean, to sit there and say I spent over 10 years dedicated to software engineering, programming, saying this is the path, and then to just say, all right, I got to walk 99% of the way down this mountain just to go up the different and traverse that other peak. That's a huge gamble, a huge gamble. It's weird. Now it doesn't really feel like a gamble, but it's a huge pivot to internally make, to kind of trust yourself, or to have, it's like almost like the desire of reaching that other peak, to see the valley from a different view is worth going back down and climbing up a different mountain. It's almost like there's this weird knowing that there's a different view from that mountain, and so it's worth spending the extra, even if it takes twice as long, right? This other mountain takes twice as long to climb. It's worth that journey.
Yeah, well, but I would argue, like, in the moment, it feels like you're, basically traversing or coming down the entire mountain. But in retrospect, you're probably more so swinging over to the next mountain, and maybe that next mountain's higher, but you're never, like, a decade worth of work, even in a completely different industry, is not ever wasted. So I feel like, maybe
Sure.
maybe it's not equal, but you're definitely, I don't think you're starting from the bottom of even if in a brand new industry, you're swinging over and you're taking all of those learned experiences and whatnot, including just like with yourself personally, and it's like your backpack's filled with the right stuff, and now you're on the track and see kind of where it goes next. Because I mean, you could swing on to another one and so forth, and you just keep kind of up, leveling up in a way, right?
Oh, for sure. And to even expand on that, I've started seeing that recently with the development of AI, because even now, looking at it from like a spiritual lens or a consciousness lens, I have that background of computer engineering. So I understand the
Yeah,
fundamental principle of the way that AI is learning, the way that they're being trained, and all these different aspects. And so it's an interesting duality of seeing, like, I don't want to say playing middleman, but at least seeing that we need both of these aspects. Like, there's a lot of fear that kind of is getting circulated around AI. And I think there's probably um, what's the word I want? There is there's a lot of validity in that fear, but I believe that if we are at least elevating ourselves, asking good questions, coming into tune with who we are and what we are, then AI could be one of the greatest, most resourceful items that we could ever possibly use in the entire world. But with that being said, if from a spiritual place, from a place of enlightenment, from a place of knowing ourselves, knowing who we are, and knowing what our intentions are, knowing the world that we want to create, if we're out of alignment with that, if we're coming from a place like we talked about earlier, from an idea or from a baseline idea standpoint of destruction and chaos, AI is just going to
yeah,
perpetuate that into the world just based on how we program it, how we almost give it its nudge into the sphere of our doing, if that makes sense.
totally, totally. Well, I see it as like kind of the classic example that we've all seen is like when someone falls into a tremendous amount of wealth or money, typically if that foundation is not solid, you're just pouring gasoline in onto a mess, and they spiral out of control, and that's when you start seeing just all this irrational behavior, and people just basically self-exploding or imploding, in a way. It's always been there.
Yeah.
It's just now you're adding, gas on that fire, essentially. And I feel like it's the same thing with AI, because it could be, I, I I I get the sense that like many of us will, depending on the industries that we're in, like almost become producers overnight. Like I think of designers, like if I was a illustrator or any kind of designer, and I had a business around that, I'd just be looking at, I've got two businesses now. One off premium custom original art that is created by a human and stamped by a human. And then the other business, a different clientele. I'm the one going to generate the prompts for that AI to create the work that you're looking for, because I'm the expert in putting in the inputs, because I know the industry. And to me, that seems really interesting, really exciting, and a way to evolve with the technology, right? And I feel like there's going to be a lot of that happening. And when it comes to the spirituality piece and like anyone working in that space, I feel like that whole industry is about to explode even further, because the more we go down this route of AI and technology and so forth, that kind of pushes you away from those like who am I questions and stuff like that. People are going to be, at one point really seeking guidance and experts to help counterbalance what's going on. That's just my prediction, but we'll see what happens.
Well, I think I'm on board with that prediction as well. I mean, from a personal perspective, I'm on board with that, but then even from a more recent perspective, right? Because whenever the C word, the whole C word came out, um, it really forced people to go inward. I mean, you could see in Google Trends
Yeah.
there was a rise in the word of meditation, and because of that. And I think even with AI, it's going to, like, automation in general is going to revolutionize so many jobs and industries that it's going to force people out of jobs. And when you don't have work, when you don't have a job, it really asks you or begs that question of who am I? What am I doing here? Where am I going for knowledge or for purpose or for fulfillment? How do I find that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think personally, it's quite amazing to hear you say that, because I know whenever I was a sophomore in high school and I took or a junior in was I a junior in high school? I was a junior in high school and I took a computer programming class. And I remember the very first program I wrote, which is called Hello World. And I guess you probably know this being a software guy now. And then, so for those who don't know, Hello World is essentially the first program that you write whenever learning a language. And the whole goal is just to write Hello World onto a screen. And I kid you not, the very first time I saw that, it blew me away with how powerful computers were. What would this have been? This would have probably been like 2010. So like, it was just after like kind of the dot-com bubble burst, and I guess we're
Yeah.
starting to get back on our feet about technology and banks, like the banking, recession and everything. So, in my life, I guess I can't say for sure, right, being in high school, but it felt to me that people weren't 100% sold on computers in 2010. But now, like less than 10 years later, or I guess it's 12 years later, but people really started seeing like, okay, obviously computers are the way forward. Obviously AI, like no one
Mm-hmm.
today is still going to
Yeah.
be doubting that progress. And so I found it honestly,
Yeah. It's
like,
interesting.
to stroke my ego a little bit here, right? I was like very much, I guess, in tune. Like that was probably the first and one of the only intuitive downloads I think I had of like, okay, computers are the future. I should learn computers. So that's why I went into computer engineering. Like that was my mindset. I was like, this is fascinating to learn about. I know it's the future. I should learn this. And it's weird because I felt like whenever this whole thing happened, whenever I got into the podcast, I kind of had that same exact like click. That same exact click happened.
Okay.
It was super cool having long form conversation with people. I realized I gravitated towards spirituality, and it seemed like something that was going to be in the future, right? Whether it was for me or for other people, I don't know. So I found that, we can obviously break down how that happened, but it seems like it's very fascinating. It seems like those two things have been a cornerstone epiphany of both of the careers that I have pursued in my life, right? Computer engineer and spiritual podcaster. And it's just like there's some sort of knowing within me that this is going to be the future in some way. So I might as well get into it before the entire fire has been completely, lit, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like, are you seeing the intersect yet? Like, are your computer like engineering days and development days or software engineer and whatnot, like, or programming, I should say, like, is there any desire to incorporate that skill set at all in what you're currently doing? And I don't know, maybe that's showing up in how you're thinking about AI as well. But I wonder if you're going to find yourself writing some code, soon.
It's an interesting question. I have gotten the question if I've had any like feelings to go back to it. I haven't had like an idea to go back. I haven't really had the full like drive, if you will. I still like loved it whenever I was doing it. Really the reason I got out of it was just like I didn't want to be in that system. I was, trying
Mhm.
to find something else. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to engage that, you know, intuition side of me, that feeling side, that more creative feminine side. So, I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. I definitely have looked at AI in terms of content creation because it seems like that's just like going to be a given. I'll give it this podcast and it'll say, okay, here's a really great clip that's going to get to millions of views. Like that's just going to happen at some point. Uh,
Yeah.
I don't really have a drive to create that myself. So personally, the drive hasn't been there. Here's where it gets interesting though, and I'm just kind of thinking about this on the fly, is as I was kind of transitioning out of software engineering, I had for a year, I worked as like the CTO in a company, and it was a startup, and it didn't end in the best case scenario, but I really found that, as I'm sure you've had your plenty of experiences with that.
Yes.
Yeah. But I was in a position where I was taking the ideas from the CEO and being able to translate them into engineer speak, if you will, because
Okay.
the CEO would
Yeah.
be like, I want this to do this. And so I would have to be there and say, well, okay, like it's going to take some time because of the way it's set up, and have to be that mediary role. And so
Mhm.
I
I needed you in our app days. That's exactly one of our downfalls.
damn. Just, I guess I found the wrong startup.
Yeah, yeah.
But that was really energizing. And for like a little bit, I was like kind of advertising myself as being that middleman. I think CTO is probably the best terminology for it. And so I certainly, anyone listening, even for you, Mark, like I'm definitely open to a position like that in the future, or, right now, if you will. But I haven't, you know, I feel like that's a much better use of my talent. And because I even said this whenever I was like kind of in that position, is like, yes, I can program. Yes, I can make these things, writing, sitting down and typing. But from my experience, there are people who are far better programmers than I. And there are far better people at executing certain ideas. But I truly believe that maybe that's the pivot that's going to come up at some point in the near future, because we're talking about this. I don't think I've talked about this on the podcast before.
Well, I was gonna say, just keep your eyes and ears and intuition open. That's all.
Yeah, I
See
mean,
what happens.
hey, I'm open to it. Anyone listening, I'm open to it. So let's talk if you got a cool idea. But yeah, I mean, it's super fascinating, and I think that's probably also something that if we even take a step back and look at kind of social media as a whole, right? Because this is really what's crazy, right? Is even sitting down and listening to, when they're interviewing Mark Zuckerberg, or, the people from Google or the people from Apple, is like, they have no idea what they're talking about. Like, they're talking to the CEO of Facebook about Google, and they're talking to the CEO of Google about iPhone. And it's like the questions they're asking, it's like, and then I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I'm getting excited here. But like, then you'll see a video of it, and half the comments are like, oh, this guy on Google's like dodging his question. And I'm kind of sitting there because I love the conspiracy theories. But to me, I'm like, no, he literally can't even answer this question because it's such a bad question that he can't even give a solid answer of yes or no. And so so to your question, maybe that is kind of the direction that my life is heading, that there is some sort of, geez, I'm feeling my body kind of a light up as I'm even saying this, is that there is some sort of emergence of our consciousness of humanity and computers that is in my future that I haven't, come across yet.
Well, wouldn't that be exciting? I mean, I'm excited for you. I feel like something's coming.
I feel like we just stumbled on something. I don't know what it is, but a prophetic future of some sort there.
Well, that pyramid behind you started to levitate a bit. I don't know if you noticed that.
Did you see that? No,
Yeah.
I didn't see it. I felt it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man,
That's awesome.
No, but I think our society certainly needs. It's a lot, man, because even looking at all this stuff that's kind of happened with like FTX or the crypto space and scammers with money and getting away with all this stuff. I mean, the people in power, I mean, look, I get it. I get the point of government. I think there's a valid option for it. There's a reason we need government, but like, they're just so far behind. It's crazy. There is no, the intelligence isn't even there, right? So whenever people sit here and say like, is it arrogance or ignorance? I think it's just ignorance mostly whenever it comes to the crypto stuff, whenever it comes to social media, like it's almost as if we don't even have the education in place to have a valid conversation of, in certain situations, are they just getting paid off, or do they seriously not know? Because even with like the whole FTX thing, like he was the one paying them and supplying them with the information at the same time. So it's like how can they even make a good decision here?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think this, one of the starting points is everyone outside of government, you know, that is part of, I mean, it's all of us, part of the system, is to just be honest with ourselves first and foremost, that unfortunately, the majority of the people that are in those institutions and governments don't have our best interests at heart. And I think there's like especially with health and all, like it's so obvious now that as you really start to unpack like some of the biggest issues, they don't have our interests at heart. Like as much as that's the narrative, and as much as I think we want to believe that, then we just need to be honest with ourselves. And I'm not saying this from like a doom and gloom perspective, but if we can at least be honest with that, then we can start asking the right questions of, okay, well, this is, what's being proposed, or this is the situation. Well, let's talk about it, because I know your interest is not just to make me healthier. That's been disproven several times now, over and over again. So let's just talk with the real facts about the real facts here, and try to move forward with the real information, not a narrative.
Right.
You
And
know,
that's, man, and this kind
like
of,
Russell Brand went on a rant the other day on Joe Rogan's show about this. Like, what did he said something to the effect of, they were talking about, they were talking about obviously the pandemic, and it's like the pandemic and world wars. Like, you can't expect a different outcome or a positive outcome if so in the health space, if the pharmaceutical company is profiting from a pandemic, or government and private companies are profiting from making, weapons for war. Like, it doesn't work. Like, how can that like, how can you fix those problems if the people trying to fix them are profiting from them? Like that, like that's no one talks about that though. Like, it's so
right.
logical, is it not?
Yeah, we could definitely talk
So
about
let's
it
just,
here if you want.
like,
Let's
well,
start.
I mean, I don't have like, I don't know. I mean, I'll flow with whatever you've got, or wherever you want to go. I don't have any massive solutions, but I'm just tired of people not asking, again, coming to the questions, not asking these questions. And conspiracy theories aside, which, many of those actually have, as you mentioned, come true. We like, let's just stick with the facts of what's happening here. And this isn't new, like this has been happening for a long time. So even with that information, okay, so that's not going to change overnight. Like, there's a lot going on here. But let's just stop. Like, you're just wasting everyone's time, and people are dying because of these ridiculous setups.
Yeah. My big thing's always follow the
I don't know.
money. My big thing's always follow the money.
Yeah,
What was it? We gave
totally.
300. I mean, what, the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense is the ex-Raytheon CEO, and we gave, what, 300 some million dollars to Ukraine to buy Raytheon equipment for the war.
Yeah.
And it's a vicious cycle. And
Do people just not want to know that? Is that what it is? Because it's like, it's there, like, especially the pandemic stuff. Like, the information is there.
I think
like, what is it?
I think there's a multitude of things, right? I don't think it's either or. It's usually and I think a lot of people just are like, I want to just hang out with people. I just want to talk to Mark on the weekends. I want to chill. I want our friends to, we just get along. Like, hey, you want to come over, Mark? Like, let's just hang out. Let's chill. Like, you don't want to, I don't think you want to believe it, but you also just, there's a part of your mind that you don't associate with people who make millions of dollars off of war. So you just, that's like out of your realm of belief that even exists. It's kind of like, whenever the whole kind of pedophile thing kind of rolled out, it's like you don't, there's a part of you that doesn't want to believe it, I don't think, because if that's true, then that means that there are kids that were sexually abused in terrible ways.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want it to be true, And then on top of that, you don't know anybody who does that type of stuff. So it's like, how can you even mentally rationalize or even think about, what that is?
Yeah.
And then I think it's a mixture of ignorance is bliss. It's a mixture of, I just want to hang out with Mark. Like, just leave us alone. Let me hang out with Mark. Let our families hang out. Let's talk about some fun things. And then I think the problem is, and things have to get to a place where it's so bad that it takes good men to do heroic actions in order for it to actually fix it. They have to do something crazy. They have to stand up against evil. And hopefully it gets to a place before it gets so bad that you end up in a place like North Korea or,
Yeah.
China. China's pretty bad, but it's not North Korea standards, if you will. So it's like, you almost don't want to believe, who's the girl that's coming out and Yaomi Park, who escaped from North
Yeah.
Korea. Like, her story, like, dude, there's shit that she talks about in there, and I don't want to get too dark here because it gets dark, but her story is so dark that you just can't even mentally conceptualize the things she
So true.
talks about. And there's a part of you that doesn't want
Yeah.
to believe that that exists. And rightfully so, but it's, becomes that balance of like, well, I'm just going to live my best life and everything should work itself out. And I do believe that there's truth to that. But then there's that, it's an interesting
Yeah.
blend. I think it's just a mixture of all of the above.
Yeah. Well, and it's at least for me, like, it becomes overwhelming in the sense of like, I also don't want to live life just like, which unfortunately I feel like a lot of this is happening right now, where I absolutely trust no one, essentially.
Hmm.
Like, it's just not a fun way to live. Like, always, like, I'm, obviously big on the questions or the question guy, but sometimes I just want to roll too, I don't have to do 1,000 hours of research on something that there's really qualified people that they're supposed to be the experts on, but then for multiple reasons, usually follow the money situations, it's like, oh well, now I can no longer trust what you just said. So now I'm spent, you've got to spend hours looking at this, looking at that, and I guess there's some benefit because that does train your mind to see different perspectives and do the research and whatnot, but it just feels so counterproductive to a system, and there's many of these systems that are supposed to be designed to, you know help us all, essentially, and in many cases it's doing the exact opposite.
I
you know
What's coming to mind is that there needs to be the system of checks and balances, right? Look, the founding fathers figured it out, right? If you don't have a system that's checking and balancing itself, then it's just going to run out of control. If you put one supreme
yeah.
dictator in control, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's, stuff that our entire country was founded upon. And I think even in this FTX situation, even in the crypto space still today, there are no checks and balances. As
Hmm.
great as it is, as much as I love Bitcoin, there are going to be nefarious actors that come along with this new technology that are going to abuse it. There's
Yeah.
no shortage of rug pulls that people pull on people and nobody goes to jail. Maybe they get a slap on the wrist or a fine. Even with the most recent bank, what was it, the Silicon Valley Bank? All the people at
Yeah.
the top just randomly decided to pull out all of their money a couple weeks before it crashed. It's like,
Yeah.
and who gets screwed? It's like they don't get screwed. It's like all the people who invested in them get screwed, and yet they
Yeah.
get out with their millions of dollars. And it's like, I it's again, just comes back to one of those things. Is I think that you just see it. I think more prevalently. There's a couple things going on. I think number one, whenever corruption happens, more corrupt things are just going to come to the surface. You're just going to see them more frequently. And if we don't
Hmm.
have these checks and balances, these kind of things to keep us honest, we have a tendency to lose ourselves, is my perception. Is that,
Yeah.
if so many people tell you that you're God, that you're amazing, that you have all the answers, you're not going to listen to what other people have to say. You're not going to keep yourselves in between. And if we want to relate this back to the questions, like, that's, I think, a powerful thing about questions is constantly keeping ourselves in check, constantly questioning ourselves. Am I on the right path? Am I helping people? Am I causing more good or more harm. And I mean, I know even for myself, what was it? Oh, I got a lot of backlash for this, was like, I still think about this a lot, which is like the whole Kanye West situation, whenever he kind of went down his whole thing. And there was a piece of me that was like, look, like, I feel like he's trying to embody the spirit of casting love to all, right? Like, love everyone as if they need love. And I think at some level he was trying to articulate that whenever he was going on his like whole Hitler rant, was like that he was trying to show us that
Yeah.
Hitler needed love. Hitler needed more love. That's why he did terrible things. And I think that it's a very difficult thing to say, especially in the current climate of society. It's a difficult thing to talk about. It's difficult, and you want to have that conversation without creating more hate along that path. So, I know in my, like, in older podcasts, I think I was a little bit careless whenever I would kind of say these things, like, probably coming from a place of ego or a place of, um, just love everybody. Like, I know how it is. And there's a level of that checks and balances, right? The audience, if you will, needs to check, like, I can't believe you would say this, and it's like, yeah, like, okay, fine, fair, it was misunderstood, but there's a level of responsibility on me to articulate my thoughts in a way that are helping people, as opposed to creating more, I don't want to say harm, but at least more, less fear or less anger in a situation like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think like in that's his situations, that's probably the biggest thing, was just there were major communication challenges on getting some of these
For
messages.
sure.
And obviously some of, again, like, I think there's extremes, right? And somewhere the answer relies in the middle. The parts that I do agree with some of the stuff Kanye was saying was just challenging, again, the status quo of things. And some of the stuff he said was a bit out there for me, for sure. But I think what I found interesting, what I've learned in the whole process is, again, regardless of whatever the statement was, whatever the message, because there's so many, is that there's no openness to challenge any kind of narrative or conversation that goes against what you believe,
And that's the problem.
in a respectful way. Like, I think that's the big one, is like to be able to have, a place or a safe place to have conversations. And I think both parties have to come to it with respect, but like at least provide that option for dialogue, right? Like, I'm curious, like, now you've got me thinking. I want to try to see, like, if there's examples in the Socrates world of, these are big questions and dialogue going back and forth, challenging assumptions, challenging, a hypothesis, your statements and stuff like that. Like, how did they handle, polar opposite opinions or answers in those forms and whatnot? I don't know what the answer is. Maybe it's not good, but it's worth at least exploring to see, what's going on, because what's happening right now is also not healthy.
Yeah, and there's a level, I think, of that conversation needing to happen. And look, and this is also another crux of this conversation, right? Is of having long form discussions. Like, whenever people sign up for my podcast, I'm like, it's 3 hours. I want to do 3 hours. Whenever it's 2 hours, it feels like it's left off, because I mean, look, we're over the 2 hour mark and we're kind of getting into a pretty strong point of the conversation. Meanwhile, and I think this is probably indicative of our society, meanwhile, you have the TikTokification of social media, where everything is just this quick 5-10 second thing. Meanwhile, I want to take that opposite approach. Like, there has to be a whiplash at some point where people are like, screw this. There's something wrong with this 10-second addiction. I need to get back to a place where it's like a long thought out conversation. And again, maybe this is that intuitional poke that I've been feeling along the way. And
Yeah,
I mean, kind of going back though, even to the other conversation, right, where it comes to these grandiose ideas. And this is kind of a part of that process that I figured out, where it's like, me and you being two white males, we can't, like, in today's society, I don't think we can have a conversation on a public forum like this about, women issues or African American issues, because it just, the people who we would have the best intention of helping, it's going to fall on deaf ears. And so what
Yeah.
I've kind of realized along this process is whenever I do have on somebody of color or a woman, that's whenever I'll ask the questions along, like, sexual abuse from a woman's perspective, or slavery from the perspective of manifestation and all is one, because those are the people who would be able to reach out to certain communities. Whereas, like, two white men sitting in a room aren't going to be able to, it's just going to come across as racist, or it might go the wrong direction, where again, it's going to
Yeah.
create more of that ill intent as opposed to being more constructive as the intention of it might be.
Totally. Yeah. I 100% agree on that one.
Yeah. There was
Yeah.
so to bring it back to your book, we don't want to sit in that for too long.
I love it.
What was it that you wrote in here? You wrote something in here that I wanted to expand upon. Can I find it? Oh, shit, I'm not going to be able to find it off the top of my head. I wanted to pivot back to this. Why am I building this? Let's start off here. While I'm looking for this, did you have a favorite chapter or a favorite segment as you were writing this?
That's always the $1 million question, or heart. It's just like, do you have a favorite prompt? And kind of answer that in the same way. It changes. It's like just like how I suggest to consume the book as a reader, and that is like to go through the table of contents and see what pops for you. There's a reason, a chapter or a question will surface intuitively. So I see it the same way. Like at the time when I was writing the book, the person in the chapter that resonated the most and I needed to hear the most was the one covering Jerry Colonna and all around the idea of meeting life as it is, or where you're like kind of accepting life as it is, for example. Because there's still very much in those times, like very kind of muddy waters. Like I was doing a lot of the reflection myself, but just trying to see, like, there wasn't super clear paths yet. And it's getting clearer and clearer, but just so then, his chapter and his wisdom helped me at least just trust the journey and know that, all of this is happening for a reason, and to, again, trust my own practices and essentially follow the recipe of the book, and that, the right paths will surface and so forth. And I think that continues to happen, and I'm trying to stay true as much as possible to that.
Yeah. So in the way you're kind of talking about this is to actually like look through, like come with a question and then kind of look through the chapters and see which one kind of sticks out to you. And
not even come with a question. I mean,
no,
just even open it up. And like the reason why the process for selecting the individuals to profile was a topic that we spent a lot of time on, and it was designed intentionally to bring people to light that some readers may not know who they are, even though if you're a nonfiction author, you probably know of James Clear, but of Atomic Habits, but many people don't know who he is, for example. But everyone knows Picasso. Everyone knows Maya Angelou for the most part. So the idea was to have a mix of introducing to other people, but then also people that immediately would attract some sort of attention. And then from there, now that you're kind of, alert, follow, okay, well, is it the person? Is there something about that person that you want to learn more about? Or is there something about the opening prompt on the table of contents beside that person that attracts you? And typically when you follow that intuition, there's something that's linked to something that you need, whether that's personally or professionally. And that's why that suggestion is there, because then, ideally, in most cases, you'll get more out of the chapter because it's, something you could apply right away. And then it leads to, okay, well, then who's next, for example, and so forth.
Yeah, something kind of even as you were talking there, and I was thinking about this as I was reading the book as well, was that you could also use it almost as like a tarot deck, if you will, where it's like a kind of how you were saying with the affirmations, you just pick a random page. And
Yeah.
so I'm going to try to find a page right here. I'm going to set the intention to grab onto a question that relates to what we were just talking about. Okay, right there is calling to me. Let me see what we find here. Oh, final thought. Get out of your head and into your own body. Let me see here. What was the question? What do I feel? This is interesting, by Dan Doughty.
Dan Doty.
Dan Doughty.
Yeah, big men's work. We haven't talked about that at all. But in those days of when my company was imploding, or when we were deciding to shut it down, the men's group that I have, which was formed through Dan Doty originally, and I still meet with this group every second Monday, was absolutely instrumental in helping process the emotion from the situation, because it's a group that continues to be full judgment free, a zone where it's not to go there to get advice unless you ask for it, and then the men will give any advice that they feel could be helpful. It's more, I hear you and I feel you, and that sucks, and sometimes that's all we need to hear. Or and equally amount of times, that's amazing, I'm so happy for you, I feel your excitement and the passion and the energy in your voice, and it's just connecting,
Yeah.
with other humans.
And I love how this played out, because I don't know if you noticed this as that transition there, but I was just saying how, two white men can't talk about slavery or women's issues. But then we found a way through the power of this book and tarot to come into, okay, the connection between men and emotions, right? Or men and their feelings. Because this is very
Yeah,
much something that I think in Western society, well, I know in Western society that if there's one big disconnect, it's probably between men and their emotional state, or men and how they feel. So this is actually
it's definitely a big one.
yeah. So this is actually really powerful, because even through my podcast, I basically just go off of intuition, whatever feels right, whatever feels aligned. So how have you seen then, even maybe throughout your life, or with Keo, did you pronounce it Keo? Kyo?
Yeah, Keo. Yeah,
Keo. With
Keo.
Keo, with, even where you're at now, where how's kind of like your relationship between feeling and being a man, like the interconnectivity of that, how have you seen that change, and it changed the world around you?
Well, the biggest thing that actually comes to mind pulls on the thread that we spoke about earlier around breaking generational patterns and cycles, because what I would say, outside of just helping my own mind heal from different experiences, and having a feeling of safety and support from the group of men, the other big benefit has been speaking to I have two boys now, but definitely Caleb, who's going to be 7. It's probably a little bit more like old enough, like speaking to him in a different way that I grew up, like I my I had a very typical father, very, very loving father, but just, again, like exactly what you described, in terms of there was no emotion, demonstrated in the house, or like any big like I love yous and things like that. Definitely no tears. Like later on in life, yes, but not. I don't remember that, in the moment. And just going through this process with these guys, um, giving the permission to change that pattern, and speak to my son in a way to show him that emotions are okay, and more than okay, human. Even when some of those bigger life shifts happen, where I felt I'm really emotionally rocked. I remember one of the guys, because I was spending the day. I took the rest of the day off, and I was going to spend the day with my son. It was just the two of us. My wife was gone, and one of the guys said, it's okay to tell your son. You don't have to give him the details; he won't understand. But it's okay for you to just say, Dad's having a bad day today. It's not you. It's just Dad's just having a bad day. If I seem a bit off, and just by doing that, like, because had I not done that and my emotion was off in a way, especially at a young age like that, there's so much going on that they're picking up where there could have been like, have I done something to create this mood or whatever it is? Right. So just setting that, making it okay and having that conversation is something I would not have intuitively, and definitely was not taught, from my own dad to do. So I'm excited or I'm proud of that kind of work that continues to happen. And he knows, like, it's Monday, every second Monday. And it's like, oh yeah, Dad's going to the men's group. And like, it's part of normalcy in our home. And at one point, I'm sure he's going to ask, like, well, like, what, what goes on in this men's group, and I can't wait, for that day, and I'll explain to him and so forth. And hopefully he, creates his own group at one point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's so powerful. I mean, even just, it seems like there's a connection here with like being vulnerable, right? Like that ability to even just say,
Yeah.
I'm not doing too well today. It's okay. Like everything's going to be all right, but just today's a little off. And
Yeah.
I mean, especially kids, because I mean, kids are just, they're tuned in. Like they got no logical brain going
They are
on.
tuned.
They know all the energies that are going around in the house. I want to keep away from like the personal, but there's like a rough situation going on within my somewhat family situation, and there's kids involved, and I'm like, it's fascinating because I try to take a higher level perspective to it, and to see the way that the parents try to like navigate around it is kind of comical to me, because I'm like, they're trying to hide all this shit, but like the kids know. I'm like, the kids are smarter than you give them
Oh
credit
yeah.
for. It's crazy. And yet that seems like another thing that our society has done, is that we've almost, I don't know how to articulate this, but have taken away the voice of the child. And something feels off about that, in the sense of, giving the kid a say at the table, where it's like putting too much authority in the child, but almost empowering the child, if you will. Because I even still see it in, neighbors today, where some neighbors will kind of just talk past you if you're around your parents, where it's like, I still even feel a little weird
Mm-hmm.
around people who I referred to as like Mr. So and so, because like now I'm at the age where it's like, okay, do I go to first name, or are we still doing Mr.? And then
Yeah. Yeah.
it sets up this odd dynamic of, you know, like, I don't want to say don't respect your elders, because I do agree that there is a huge amount of value there, but there's almost not any value placed on the idea of newness or new ideas. And hell, this might
Mm-hmm.
even go back to our political conversation earlier, like the newness of new ideas, new people coming into Congress, new people presenting forth new ideas that could help us evolve in a certain path. And I think there's so much value in that, but it seems like that is almost lost on our generation as well. So there might be a connection there as well between new ideas, children, feeling, and kind of this masculine space that we're in as a society.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think probably the link to it all is just, feeling out the feelings and not numbing out. Like, it starts, I feel, it starts at a young age for whatever reason. And I'm sure there's going to be things that we do over here as parents that have effects, and it's par for the course in a way. But what and my wife and I talk about this often, because we, sometimes it gets to the point where we get anxious. Like, we don't want, obviously, to inflict that on any of our kids. And what we typically come back to, though, is it's inevitable. Like, we're humans. We're going to make mistakes as well. But if we can equip them to think critically, and also be able to jump into self-inquiry when it, when they're old enough to understand, and at least at this age, be able to, when our son's freaking out or having a tantrum of some sort, like ask the questions, like what emotions are you feeling, and just breathe through that, like just help them be more tapped into those emotions, so that doesn't lead to these areas where you numb out with whatever, whether that's substances or other behavior, like whatever. There's usually something that we're trying to numb out, which also numbs out new ideas and the way we think, and all of that stuff. Like, to me, it all comes back to what's going on in the mind, right? And definitely from an emotional perspective. So yeah, so I think I don't know. I mean, I definitely don't have all the answers for that, but what we're definitely trying on this side is to make it okay to talk about how we're feeling. Even like, my son is really, really passionate about drawing, and he'll often come to me and like, "Hey dad, like what do you think of this drawing?" And my default reaction is typically like, "Yeah, it looks really great. Like, great job," which, is probably a good thing to say, but I'm trying to say, it looks awesome. How does it make you feel?
Mm.
Right. And just those little prompts to get him, starting to think about, okay, I feel really proud about what I created here, and like go in, enter into a dialogue like that. I was never asked something like that as a kid. And there's no fault or shame or anything like that. I mean, again, my dad was, following probably what was happening with his dad. And I definitely know for a fact it was 1,000 times worse in terms of that
Sure.
generation. So, he in a way, I'm sure, was trying to break a certain pattern, and did in many ways. And I'm trying to break a certain pattern, and I'm sure it's just going to continue.
I'm trying to break all of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, something in your answer that really stuck out to me, which I didn't really fully, I think, embody until I was deeper on the spiritual path, was like this idea of tools and what certain tools you can use, right? Like
Yeah.
whether it's meditating, whether it's journaling, whether it's using your dreams, whether it's in some cases channeling, whether it's using a book as a tarot card deck, and it sounds like that's kind of like the process that you're even giving your kid now, right? Like you don't want to make them, what is it, like you don't want it's something like the tyrannical mother wants to make her child invincible, but it's
Yeah.
almost like you can't really make them invincible to a world that's always changing. You have to give them tools to be able to adapt to this world that's always changing, and through the tools, yes, there will be struggle, yes, there will be some sacrifice and some downfalls, but at least they have the tools in order to get them through those difficult moments.
Totally. Totally. Because I mean, even I think even for myself, like without the tools, that's where you start to self-destruct. And I wish, like, the tools are endless, of course, and that's what's kind of exciting about being on this whole journey. There's always new things to discover and experiment with, but for the most part, even when I was going to school, like, just, and I'm sure you can resonate, like we didn't have this stuff. And I have the opportunity to speak to different college and university classes and whatnot, and it's sad and scary, because I often get them to check in with one word answers, which is the same thing that we do in our men's group every time.
Mm.
That's how it starts. How do you feel today? One word. You just check in, and like it's a way for us to come in with the real emotion of the moment. And the check-ins from students are 90+% high stress, full minds, fearful, like, you know, not positive emotion. Let's just say that. And I don't remember that level of stress when I was in school. I'm sure
Sure.
when you were in school as well. I mean, there were pressures, of course, but not to this point where this is, and uh, you know, it it's clear, because we do have a full on mental health crisis. Like it's no surprise. And it's just getting worse, in a way. And when you start looking at everything that's going on in the world, and this is kind of where I'm trying to bring it all together, like everything that we've been talking about, like those are huge, huge topics that you know, if you let your mind go on them, like it's not very optimistic, you know, to come into to that world. So at the very least, I hope we can all do, and this is why I'm so passionate about the book and the film series, and the original reason for targeting actually musicians for this next project was to reach a younger demographic that those people look up to give them the tools, or at least a tool or something, you know, to be able to process all of the stuff that's going on, so that they hopefully, um, again, can live, you know, a thriving life and feel good and be happy doing so, um, as we all deserve once again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like our, feels like it's one of those things that people talk about. It's like your birthright, or it's your divine, divine right, your divine, trying to think of the best way to articulate this, but just like the divineness of just being you, right? You get that ultimate freedom that's allowed or bestowed
Hmm.
upon you. And it seems to me, is this something maybe, right? Because we're talking about all these tools, and I know that I've been shown a lot of tools since getting into the spirituality space, but I don't think that I really came across too many or any. I mean, there's some, but it seems like a lot of them were coming from a place of more fear based, right? You got to work, you got to grind, you got to do, you got to push yourself to the brink of exhaustion if you want to get anywhere. And a lot of those seem like they come from a place of more fear or scarcity versus more holistic or more enlightened, let's say, tools. How do people find, enlightened tools, if you will? All right, and we are back from our classic interruption that happens every now and then on this program. uh but the question that I was getting to was, is how do we find tools that come from a place of, I guess, enlightenment, but let's say higher vibration, like higher vibrational tools. How do we find those or even use those?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I have the answer to that, other than I think we need to be in a state of intention to seek those kind of tools. Like the closest thing that comes to mind for me, because I catch myself doing this often, because I'm probably most asked about journaling, given that's kind of my baseline practice, and you know, as you can probably tell, where all the questions come from and so forth, and often speak about journaling, the prompts, and different, you know, question flows and so forth from the perspective of how to handle high pressure situations, or situations where we have unwanted emotions showing up and so forth, or checking in to identify fear and anxiety and whatnot, which are all, you know, valid and valuable approaches to journaling. But there is a whole other side to it, where it's can be pure gratitude, can be, again, those questions like, what if everything went right? Or, um, you know, like, what is it about the path that I'm on that I'm excited about? Like, there's a whole other angle or perspective to a practice like journaling that can be on the positive, and uh, prime our minds to, you know, see more clearly, prime our minds to see the positivity, the good, and all of that. So, like anything, like, you know, you put the intention out there, or you start, you know, directing your mind that way, then you'll start coming across these different tools. For the longest time, I was looking for a replacement for meditation, because at the time I was just, I don't know, I was just wasn't vibing with meditation. I was trying different practices, and for whatever reason, it just wasn't flowing really well. Then breath work entered into my life, and I was like, wow, this is exactly what I've been looking for, which, in my opinion, is kind of like a combination of meditation and journaling, especially in breath holds with prompts and so forth. Plus, you know,
Mm.
physical feeling of energy, or oxygenating the body. So, you know, it was just kind of putting that out there, and probably the through line of this whole conversation, just being tapped into your intuition and following those signs. And the other thing too is like, so I guess, because where I often get most of my tools is through conversations like these, and making sure that your, whether it's your podcast feed, or let's just call it your content source or sources, are aligned with what you're looking for. And, like for me, that's usually a combination of books and podcasts, as well as any kind of articles and stuff like that I'm clipping, but I'm really intentional with the sources of that material, especially if I'm going to read any of that in the morning or listen to a podcast in the morning and so forth. It's typically, as much, I like Joe Rogan, but he's not my go-to in the morning, because I don't know what kind of topics are going to come up. And if I get kind of pulled into some of the conversations or topics that you and I were talking about, I don't want to start my morning off like pissed off at the government kind of thing, so I'll save that for listening to something like that later on, for example, and I'll have a curated feed or curated books that are 100% I know are going to put my mind in a really motivated state.
That's a good point too, of like figuring out when you want to be in what state. Oh, your browser now is preventing recording. All right, maybe all right, so we got kicked off again. We're just going to take the hint from the universe and just understand that it's trying to kick us off. It's telling us we've exhausted our time. Marc Champagne, thank you so much for being here, Marc. I have all your links. I'm going to throw them down in the show notes below. I also love giving the end of the podcast space to my guest to address the audience, air any last words of advice, or plug your stuff, whatever's feeling called to you or resonant. So the space is yours. Please reference any of the links you want down below, and yeah, floor is yours.
Oh, amazing. Well, first of all, thank you. I mean, this was fun. I mean, I've done a lot of podcasts, but to your point, there's not a lot of long form shows out there, and there is a special and unique vibe to a conversation like this. So thank you for holding space for this amount of time, and for your questions and your curiosity. I really enjoyed it. And the only thing I'll leave the audience with is, just enjoy the process and the curiosity and the discovery of these tools and these questions. And, if you can, if you're answering a question like, who am I? Or a question on the onset that might seem big or grandiose, like to just approach it with excitement instead of fear or uncertainty. And just like, I wonder what's going to come out of spending some time with this question. It's just a subtle little shift in perspective, but you'll see can make such a huge difference. And so enjoy it. Like, we only have, no matter what we're going through, like we only have this experience once, so we might as well not rob ourselves of the moments of learning, the excitement, whatever it is in between, of the current moment. So let's all enjoy it, and thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thanks, Marc. Thanks for being here. Thanks, guys, for listening. Go grab Personal Socrates. I'm sure it's available everywhere. Definitely click the link below. And yeah, last thing, the only thing else I'll ask you guys is to share this with somebody, because I know whenever we share these podcasts, it's a win-win. Win, I win, Marc wins, you win, your friend wins. So everybody, yeah, dude, it's just like, it's the perfect thing. So don't leave a review. Don't do anything. All you got to do is just share us with one person, and I'll be truly grateful. I'm just even truly grateful that you're still listening to my voice right now. So thank you so much. And like always, I will see you guys in the 6th dimension.